Somewhere in a quiet house, a lamp is still burning. The shade is the colour of weak tea, and the light it throws is soft and a little tired, the kind of light that does not ask anything of you. On the table beside it lies a magazine, open to a page that has been read more than once. The paper is thick and faintly glossy, and it carries that particular smell old magazines have, of dust and ink and rooms that have been warm for a long time. The clock on the wall keeps its slow appointment with the minutes. Outside, the street has gone to bed before you. On the open page there is a drawing. A woman in a pale dress stands with a cigarette held lightly between two fingers, her expression calm, almost amused, as though she knows something the rest of us have not yet been told. Above her, in confident letters, a few words promise that this small white object in her hand will keep her slender, soothe her nerves, and protect the very voice she sings with. And below those words, smaller, almost shy, sits a single line that changes everything. A doctor, the line says. A physician recommends it. A man in a white coat somewhere has put his name behind the promise. It is a strange thing to read now in the soft yellow light, with the house asleep around you. It seems almost impossible that anyone believed it, and yet they did. Millions of them did, for the better part of half a century, because the people telling them to believe were not selling something obvious, like soap or stockings. They were selling certainty. They were selling the calm authority of medicine itself, borrowed and bottled and sold back to a public that had every reason to trust it. Tonight we're going to follow that promise backward, all the way to where it began. We're going to walk through the offices where the words were written, the conventions where the doctors gathered, the glossy pages where the smoke curled upward in perfect grey ribbons. We're going to meet the men who decided that women were, as one of them put it, a gold mine lying in the open, waiting only to be worked. And we're going to find out how, quietly and without much fuss, the most trusted profession in the modern world came to lend its good name to one of its most expensive mistakes. This is not a loud story, despite the size of it. There are no battles here, no sieges, no armies crossing rivers in the dark. The damage was done in living rooms and waiting rooms, in the gentle voice of an advertisement, and the reassuring nod of a man you'd been taught to believe. It unfolded slowly over decades, in a manner so ordinary that most people never noticed it happening at all. That is part of what makes it worth telling softly, in the dark, when the day has loosened its grip and there's nothing left to do but listen. So settle in. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. There is nothing here that needs solving tonight, nothing that asks you to stay awake. The story will hold itself together, whether you follow every turn or drift somewhere in the middle and surface again later. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding all day. Let the breath go slow. We are simply going to wander through a strange and quiet corner of the last century, and you're welcome to fall asleep anywhere along the way. If you enjoy listening to sleepy stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. To understand how the promise took hold, you have to go back to a time before it would have made any sense at all. Picture a city street in the first years of the 20th century, early in the morning, the air still cool and smelling of horses and coal smoke and bread from the bakeries that had been up since long before dawn. Men moved through that air with cigars and pipes, and the new machine-rolled cigarettes that were just beginning to crowd out the old hand-rolled kind. The smoke belongs to them. It hangs around the doorways of offices and the steps of saloons, a masculine fog, as ordinary on a man as a hat. A woman walking through that same smoke would not have been holding any of it. To do so, in public, in those years, was very nearly unthinkable. It was the sort of act that drew stares, then whispers, then consequences. In some American cities there were actual ordinances against it. A woman could be stopped, lectured, even arrested for the simple act of lighting a cigarette on a sidewalk. The cigarette was not merely discouraged for her. It was coded, deep in the manners of the age, as something a respectable woman did not touch. The reasons were tangled, the way reasons usually are. Some of it was about class, the old fear that smoking marked a woman as coarse, as belonging to the stage or the streets rather than the parlour. Some of it was about control, about a society that kept a careful and anxious watch over what women were permitted to want. And some of it was simply habit, the deep groove that custom wears into a culture until the groove itself starts to feel like nature. Whatever the cause, the result was a wall. On one side of it stood the entire smoking world, vast and growing and profitable. On the other side stood half the population, untouched. For the men who made and sold tobacco, that wall was not a moral fact, it was a market condition. And market conditions, they knew, could change. They had watched other walls fall. They had seen products that were once the property of one class or one sex slip quietly across the line and become everyone's. The question that began to form, somewhere in the panelled offices where these things were discussed, was not whether the wall could be moved. It was who would be standing there when it did, and how much they might collect on the other side. But before any of that could happen, something else had to shift, and it had nothing to do with tobacco at all. The shape of the ideal woman was changing. For most of the 19th century, a certain fullness had been admired, a softness read as health and prosperity and ease. A woman with flesh on her was a woman whose household could afford to feed her well, and the body carried that meaning the way a good coat carries it. Thinness, in that older world, was more often a sign of illness or want than of beauty. Then, slowly at first and then very quickly, the meaning inverted. By the 1920s, the admired silhouette had narrowed almost to a line. The fashionable dresses hung straight and loose, designed for a body without curves, and the women in the magazines grew slimmer year by year until the new ideal was a kind of boyish slightness that the previous generation would have found alarming. The reasons for this are their own long story, bound up with new fabrics, new dances, new freedoms, and a culture suddenly in love with speed and youth and the clean modern line. But the effect, for our purposes, was simple and enormous. A whole society of women had been handed a new and difficult thing to want. Wanting to be thin is a particular kind of wanting, because it never fully arrives. There is no moment at which the work is done. The body is always present, always available for judgment, always a little short of whatever the pictures are showing this season. A society that teaches women to measure themselves against a narrowing line has, without quite meaning to, manufactured a permanent low-grade anxiety, distributed evenly across millions of people, renewing itself every morning in the mirror. It is not a loud anxiety, it hums underneath the day, and it is, for anyone with something to sell, a remarkably reliable thing to sell against. Now hold those two facts side by side in the quiet, the way you might hold two stones in your hand to feel their weight. On one side, an entire untouched market of women, walled off from tobacco by custom rather than law in most places, and growing restless against a great many of the walls that had been built around them. On the other, a fresh cultural ache, the new and inexhaustible wish to be slender, planted in those same women and watered daily by every fashion plate and film. The tobacco companies did not create either of these things, but they were watching both of them with great interest, and somewhere a few clever people had begun to notice that the two might be made to fit together. It helped too that the cigarette itself was changing. The hand-rolled and the cigar had been heavy, deliberate things, the smoke thick and the ritual slow. The new machine-made cigarette was light, cheap and quick, milder in the throat and easier to begin. It could be lit between errands, finished in a few minutes, carried in a slim case that fit a small bag. Where the cigar announced itself, the cigarette could be discreet. It was, in its physical form, almost designed to slip across the old line to become the kind of thing a woman might do quietly, then less quietly, then openly, until one day no one remembered it had ever been forbidden. There was also, beneath all of this, a thread of something that felt like science, and it is worth pausing on because it mattered so much later. Nicotine does, in fact, blunt the appetite a little. It nudges the body's chemistry in ways that can make hunger quieter for a while, and can keep weight slightly lower than it might otherwise sit. This is a small and complicated effect, hedged with costs that would take decades to fully understand. But it was real enough to be noticed, and a thing that is real enough to be noticed is exactly the kind of thing that can be stretched, by people skilled at stretching, into a promise far larger and far more confident than the truth could ever support. You can almost feel the pieces drifting toward each other. A market, an anxiety, a product newly suited to both. A grain of fact at the centre, just enough to build on. None of it was a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. No single room where wicked men rubbed their hands. It It was more like weather, a set of conditions gathering on their own until the air was ready for a storm that any number of people, given the chance, would happily cool down. The only thing still missing was someone bold enough and certain enough to stand up and say the words out loud. And here it is worth noticing how trust was arranged in that world, because trust is the hinge the whole story turns on. The early 20th century was the age in which medicine became modern, and with it, magnificent. Anesthesia, antiseptics, vaccines, the slow conquest of the old killing fevers. The doctor, who a few generations earlier had been a figure of mixed reputation, often as likely to harm as to heal, was becoming something close to a secular priest. People believed him. They wanted to believe him. After centuries of helplessness against disease, the white coat had become a symbol of one of the few powers that seemed genuinely to be on the side of ordinary life. That belief was precious, and it was for the most part well earned. Doctors really were learning to do extraordinary things. But a thing that valuable does not stay locked safely in the place that earned it. It radiates outward. It attaches to the coat, the title, the calm voice, the prescription pad. And once trust has become a freestanding thing, hovering around a profession like a glow, it becomes possible, for those who understand persuasion, to reach in and borrow some of that glow for purposes the doctor never imagined. That borrowing is the heart of what is coming, but we are not there yet. For now, simply rest in the world before, a world where the smoke still belonged to men, where the magazines were teaching women a new way to be unhappy with their own bodies, where the cigarette was growing lighter and cheaper and more discreet by the year, and where the figure of the doctor stood gleaming and trusted at the centre of modern life, entirely unaware of how he was about to be used. All the materials are laid out now, quiet and separate, like tools on a bench in an empty workshop. Somewhere nearby, someone is about to walk in and pick them up. Let that workshop sit in the dark of your mind for a moment. The cool air, the unlit lamps, the tools waiting in their places, the smell of metal and wood and old paper. Nothing has happened yet. No harm has been done. There is a strange peace in these moments before a story turns, a held breath that is almost restful, because for now everything is still possible, and nothing has gone wrong. Stay there with me a little while, in the quiet before. We have all night, and the man who's about to open that workshop door is in no hurry, and neither are we. The man who walked into that workshop, if we are going to give the story a face, looked nothing like a villain. He looked like a businessman of his era, which is to say, a little rumpled, a little fierce, with a cigar usually somewhere about him, and a habit of speaking in short, certain sentences that left no room on the other side of them. His name was George Washington Hill, and he ran the American Tobacco Company, one of the largest of the great tobacco concerns, and he wanted to sell Lucky Strikes to everyone alive. He's said to have kept a small replica of a Lucky Strike package on his desk, and to have stared at it the way other men stared at maps of countries they meant to take. Hill had inherited a peculiar problem, the kind that only looks like a problem to someone enormously ambitious. His product sold well. It sold, in fact, to roughly half the people it could possibly sell to. The men of the nation smoked, and Lucky Strike took its share of them. But the other half, the women, remained almost entirely outside the market, sealed off by the old custom we have already walked through. To most people this would have looked like the natural order of things. To Hill it looked like a wall with money stacked behind it, and he had spent his whole life learning to dislike walls of that particular kind. The phrase that has come down to us, whether he said it in exactly these words or whether the years have polished it, was that opening this market would be like finding a gold mine right in your own front yard. Think about the image for a moment, because it tells you how the men of that world saw what they were doing. Not as persuading anyone to take up a habit that might harm them, not as reaching across a line that society had drawn for reasons good or bad, simply as discovering wealth that had been lying there the whole time in plain sight, requiring only the nerve to bend down and pick it up. It is worth sitting with that frame in the dark, gently, without anger, because it explains so much of what follows. When you decide that a market is a gold mine in your front yard, you have already decided that the gold is yours. The only remaining questions are practical. How do you get it out of the ground? What tools will the digging require? And who, among the many people standing around, can be persuaded to help you dig, perhaps without fully understanding what they are helping with? The moral questions do not so much get answered as quietly excused from the room before the meeting begins. But Hill faced a real obstacle, and it was not a small one. He could not simply place an advertisement telling women to smoke. The wall was made of custom, and custom does not fall to a direct shove. A campaign that crudely urged respectable women to take up cigarettes would have offended the very women it hoped to reach, and the husbands and fathers and ministers standing behind them, and it would have failed loudly and expensively. The thing had to be approached sideways. It had to be made to seem not like an invitation to do something forbidden, but like permission to do something the woman already secretly wished she could. That is a different and far more powerful kind of selling. It does not push against the customer. It finds the wanting that is already there and offers itself as the answer. And so Hill and the people he gathered around him began to ask a more interesting question than how to make women smoke. They began to ask what women already wanted badly enough that a cigarette might be dressed up as the path to it. What ache was already humming under the surface of a million ordinary days, waiting for something to be sold against it? You already know the answer because we laid it out in the chapter before. The ache was the new thinness, the narrowing ideal, the daily quiet unhappiness of a body measured against a line it could never quite reach. Here was a wanting that needed no manufacturing, that renewed itself for free every morning, that lived in the same women who were not yet smoking. If the cigarette could be tied to that, if it could be made to seem like an ally in the endless private war against the next pound, then the wall would not need to be pushed at all. The women would walk through it themselves looking for something else entirely and find the cigarette waiting on the far side. There is a cold brilliance in this, the kind that is easier to admire from a safe distance of 100 years in a dark bedroom. It takes a real human pain, the pain of being taught to dislike your own body, and it does not try to soothe that pain or solve it. It harnesses it. It points it at a product. The unhappiness becomes an engine, and the engine drives sales, and the unhappiness is left exactly where it was, perhaps a little deeper now, because the thing offered as a cure was never going to cure it. This is a pattern you will see more than once before the night is through, and it is worth recognizing early, gently, the way you learn the shape of a path in the daylight so you can walk it later in the dark. Hill, by all accounts, was not a man given to brooding over such things. He was a man of campaigns. He wanted slogans short enough to remember and loud enough to repeat, images clean enough to print 1,000,000 times, and a strategy direct enough that it could be aimed and fired. What he had in the late 1920s was the outline of an idea so simple it could be carried in a single sentence. Tie the cigarette to slimness. Make the lucky strike the woman's quiet weapon against her own appetite, and do it in a way that felt not coarse but modern, not forbidden but free. He did not, however, have the particular genius required to make a whole society change its mind without noticing. That was a different kind of skill, and Hill was wise enough, or impatient enough, to go and buy it rather than try to grow it himself. He turned to the advertising men, the new professionals of persuasion who were just then discovering how much power lay in the careful arrangement of words and pictures, and the deep, half-hidden wishes of the public. And he turned, most fatefully, to a young man with an unusual surname and an even more unusual theory of how crowds could be moved. But that man deserves his own chapter, and we will come to him soon. For now, stay with Hill in his office, the cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling, the little replica package standing on the desk like a tiny monument to his ambition. Imagine the certainty of him, the absolute confidence that the gold was there and that it was his to take. There is something almost restful in watching a person who has never once doubted himself, the way there is something restful in watching deep water, as long as you are safely on the shore. He believed he was simply opening a market. He had no idea, and would not have cared, that he was opening something much larger and much harder to close. What he set in motion would outlast him by decades. The campaigns he launched would teach an entire generation of women that the cigarette was their friend, their figure's guardian, their small daily declaration of independence. Those women would teach it, without words, to their daughters. The habit, once across the wall, would not walk back, and the bill for it all, the real bill, written in a currency that had nothing to do with money, would not come due for 40 years, by which time Hill would be long gone, and the people paying it would mostly have forgotten where the debt began. But none of that weight is on the story yet. In the office, in the late 20s, it is all still upside, all still gold and front yards and the clean satisfaction of a wall about to come down. The harm is real, but it is over the horizon, invisible from where Hill is standing, the way the curve of the earth hides a ship long before it sinks. He pours another inch of certainty into his plans. The cigar burns down. Somewhere across the city, in another office, the young man with the strange surname is reading about crowds and dreams and the secret machinery of wanting, and he has no idea yet that he's about to be hired to open a gold mine. Let the office go quiet now. Let the smoke settle. We will leave Hill there, sure of himself on the edge of everything, and we will go and meet the others he gathered one by one, the way you might be introduced to the guests at a party you're too tired to fully attend. There is no rush. The wall is going to come down whether we hurry or not, and there is a particular comfort in knowing how a story ends, in being able to watch its beginning without anxiety, the way you can watch a sunrise without fear because you have seen the sun rise 1,000 times before. So let your breathing find its slow rhythm again. The first of the diggers has been introduced. He is confident, he's certain, he's entirely wrong about the size of what he's starting, and he is for the moment harmless to you, 100 years away in a smoky room that no longer exists. Rest here on the shore a little longer. The deep water is calm tonight, and when you are ready, or even if you are not, we will move on to the man whose ideas turned Hill's simple wish into something the whole century would breathe. The young man with the strange surname was named Edward Bernays, and he carried, whether he liked it or not, a famous shadow. His uncle was Sigmund Freud, the Viennese doctor who had spent his life mapping the hidden chambers of the mind, the desires and fears that move beneath the surface of what people say they want. Bernays had taken that family inheritance and turned it, with a kind of cheerful ruthlessness, toward an entirely practical end. If the mind was driven by hidden wishes, then a man who understood those wishes could move not just one person, but a whole public, gently, invisibly, without the public ever knowing it had been moved. He gave this craft a name that has stuck to it ever since. He called it public relations, though he sometimes used a blunter phrase in private, the engineering of consent. Consider how much is folded into those 3 words. Not the forcing of consent, which is tyranny, and not the asking for it, which is honest persuasion, but the engineering of it, the quiet construction of conditions under which people come to want what you wish them to want and believe the wanting was their own idea all along. It is a chilling phrase to read in the dark. It is also, you have to admit, an accurate description of a great deal of the world you live in now. When American Tobacco came to Bernays with the problem of the women who would not smoke, he did not reach for an advertisement. He understood something the cruder sellers did not, which is that a public will resist being told what to do, but will follow what it believes other people are already doing. People are herd animals dressed in coats and hats. They look sideways far more than they look forward. If smoking among women could be made to seem not like a thing being urged upon them, but like a thing the boldest and most admired women were already doing, for reasons that had nothing to do with any company, then the wall would not be argued down. It would simply stop being a wall. So Bernays went looking for a meaning to attach to the cigarette, and he found one lying close at hand, glittering and dangerous. These were the years just after American women had won the vote, after a long and bitter struggle, and the air was still electric with the language of emancipation, of breaking free, of throwing off the old constraints that had bound women for generations. Bernays took that language, that genuine and hard-won spirit of liberation, and he reached for it the way a man reaches for a tool that happens to be the right size. He decided to make the cigarette a symbol of freedom. The plan he built around this idea was a small masterpiece of its terrible kind, and it unfolded on Easter Sunday in 1929 on Fifth Avenue in New York, where the Great Easter Parade drew enormous crowds and, more importantly, the photographers and reporters of every newspaper in the city. Bernays arranged for a group of fashionable young women, carefully chosen, to walk in that parade, and, at a prearranged signal, to light cigarettes and smoke them openly, defiantly, as they strolled among the crowds. And he arranged, through a sympathetic contact, for the act to be framed not as an advertisement, which it secretly was, but as a political gesture, a protest, a blow struck for the cause of women. He even supplied the phrase that would carry it into history. The cigarettes the women lit were to be called torches of freedom, not products, not pleasures. Torches, held aloft, lighting the way toward liberation in the hands of modern women who would no longer be told what they could and could not do. The newspapers, given a story so neatly wrapped, so vivid and quotable and easy to photograph, ran with it across the country. Women smoking as an act of emancipation. Women claiming a freedom that men had always taken for granted. The cigarette in a single-staged morning transformed from a coarse vice into a banner. It is hard, lying here in the quiet, not to feel two things at once about this. There is a kind of awful elegance to it, the way a perfectly executed trick can be admired even as you recognise what it costs. And there is a deeper sadness underneath, because the freedom those women were reaching for was real. The struggle that had won them the vote was real. The wish to live without the thousand small constraints that custom had wrapped around them was as honest and as worthy a wish as any human being has ever had. And Bernays took all of that genuine longing and used it to sell a product that would, in the end, make millions of those same women sick. That is the particular cruelty buried at the centre of this part of the story, and it is worth naming softly. The campaign did not lie about the existence of women's desire for freedom. That desire was true. What it did was redirect the desire, the way you might redirect a stream, digging a small channel so that water meant for a field flows instead into your own mill. The women who lit those cigarettes, and the millions who followed the image they created, were not foolish for wanting to be free. They were simply standing near a man who had learned to point freedom wherever he chose. And here is the part that connects this chapter to the larger shape of the night. The Torches of Freedom campaign worked not by overcoming people's trust, but by borrowing it. It borrowed the trust people placed in newspapers. By laundering an advertisement into news, it borrowed the trust people placed in their own admired peers, by manufacturing the appearance of a movement. Bernays understood that the most powerful persuasion does not come from the seller at all. It comes from sources the public already believes turned quietly to the seller's purpose. Hold on to that principle. It is the same machinery that will, before long, reach for the most trusted source of all, the doctor in his white coat. The immediate effect of the parade was everything Hill could have hoped for. The taboo did not vanish overnight, but it cracked, visibly, publicly, in a way that could not be uncracked. Smoking among women became suddenly a thing associated with the modern, the daring, the free, rather than the disreputable. Other women, watching from a distance, filed the image away. The next time a cigarette was offered, or the next time a hard day made one tempting, the old wall of shame was just a little lower than it had been the week before, and lower walls, as every seller knows, are the only kind worth their attention. Bernays himself lived a very long life, long enough to watch the full consequences of what he had helped begin. In his later years, when the harm of tobacco had become undeniable, he is said to have expressed some regret, to have spoken against the very industry he had once served so brilliantly. Whether that regret was deep or merely convenient is one of those things the dark cannot decide. But there is something almost unbearably human in the image of an old man, near the end, looking back across a century at a single Easter morning, and the bright, cruel torches he had placed in those women's hands, understanding at last, too late to matter, exactly what he had set alight. Let that image sit gently in the dim room, an old man remembering, a spring morning long gone, the crowds, the photographers, the young women in their fashionable coats lighting their cigarettes on cue, believing, perhaps some of them, that they were striking a small blow for their own liberty. They were so young in the photographs. They could not have known that they were the first careful figures in a campaign that would run for 40 years, or that the freedom they were performing had been written for them by a man who understood their wishes better than they did, and cared for those wishes not at all. There is no need to carry the weight of that forward into your sleep. The morning is over, the crowds have long since gone home, the newspapers that printed the story have yellowed and crumbled into dust. The whole bright machinery of that single-staged event has wound down into stillness, the way everything does, eventually, given enough years. What remains is only the lesson, and you do not have to hold even that very tightly. Persuasion that works best borrows trust. Remember it lightly, or do not remember it at all, and let the rest go. We have met two of the diggers now, the certain businessman with his little replica package, and the brilliant nephew with his theory of hidden wishes. Between them they had cracked the first wall, the wall of shame, and made the cigarette into a symbol of freedom. But a symbol is not yet a habit, and freedom is not yet the specific promise that this whole night has been circling. For that, the campaign needed to descend from the lofty heights of liberation, down to something far more intimate and far more daily, down to the bathroom scale and the mirror and the dress that no longer quite fit. It needed to stop selling freedom and start selling thinness, and that turn deserves a chapter of its own. So let the parade fade out, let Fifth Avenue empty into the quiet, feel the bed beneath you solid and patient, asking nothing. The torches have all burned out by now, every one of them, 100 years of rain having long since put them out. You are warm, you are safe. The story will keep its shape until you return to it, and the next turn it takes, the turn toward the scale and the mirror, will be waiting exactly where we left it, in no hurry at all, whenever you are ready to follow. If you're drifting now, there is no need to fight it. Let yourself go wherever the story is taking you. If some quiet part of you would like the next one of these waiting for you when you wake, you might subscribe before you slip under, so the path is already lit. But only if you want to. There is no hurry, and nothing here asks anything of you. Sleep well. The story will keep going softly, with you or without you. The slogan, when it finally came, was so simple that you could carry it home from a single glance at a billboard and find it still sitting in your head a week later. Reach for a lucky instead of a sweet. 7 words, if you count them gently. And in those 7 words, the whole strategy we have been building toward arrived, fully formed, no longer hidden behind talk of freedom or torches, plain as a hand held out. Do not eat the candy. Smoke this instead. Stay slender. The cigarette is not a vice. The cigarette is your discipline made easy. It appeared at the end of the 1920s and ran through the early 30s, and it was everywhere. On the great painted boards beside the roads, in the glossy women's magazines beside the recipes and the fashion plates and the advice columns. The advertisements showed slim and lovely women, sometimes shadowed by a ghostly second figure, a heavier version of themselves looming behind, the future they might become if they reached for the wrong thing. Avoid that future shadow, some of the ads warned. Reach for a lucky instead. The message did not whisper. It did not need to. It had found the exact ache it was built to press, and it pressed it without mercy and without rest. Think for a moment about the elegance of the swap being proposed, the way it folds 2 anxieties into one neat motion. A woman, taught all her life to want to be slender, feels the pull toward the sweet, the small pleasure of sugar at the end of a long day. And here is a voice telling her that she need not feel guilty about denying herself, because there is another small pleasure she may have instead, one that will not cost her the figure she's been told to guard. The cigarette is dressed up not as an indulgence but as the responsible choice, the disciplined choice, the choice a woman makes when she takes care of herself. The vice has been costumed as a virtue. And the genius of it, the cold genius, is that it never had to prove very much. We touched earlier on the grain of truth at the centre, the small real way that nicotine quiets the appetite. The campaign did not need to invent its effect from nothing. It only needed to take that grain and inflate it, to let the listener fill in the rest with her own hopes. A cigarette instead of a slice of cake will, in the narrowest and most temporary sense, leave you with fewer of the day's sweets inside you. That much is almost true. Everything the listener added to it, the lifelong slimness, the effortless discipline, the body finally tamed, she supplied herself for free out of her own longing. The candy makers, it should be said, were furious, and their fury is one of the few genuinely funny notes in this long and sombre story. Here was an entire industry watching another industry tell the whole country to stop eating its product and smoke instead. The confectioners fought back in the press, took out their own advertisements, complained loudly to anyone who would listen that this was an outrage, that cigarettes were no substitute for wholesome sweets, that the campaign was a slander against candy itself. There is something almost endearing in the spectacle. 2 great commercial powers wrestling over the appetites of American women like dogs over a single bone, neither of them, you will notice, especially concerned with the women themselves. Eventually the pressure forced a small retreat. The bluntest form of the slogan was softened, the most direct attacks on sweets pulled back, after the candy industry pushed hard enough. But by then the damage, or the success, depending on which side of the counter you stood on, was already done. The association had been planted. Cigarette and slimness, sweet and shame, had been wired together in the public mind, and you do not easily unwire a thing once 1,000,000 billboards have hammered it home. The slogan could be retired. The idea it carried had already moved out of the advertisements and into people's heads, where it would live, rent-free, for decades. It is worth pausing here in the quiet to notice what this campaign did and did not do, because the distinction matters for everything that comes after. It did not yet reach for the doctor. It did not yet claim that medicine endorsed the cigarette. It worked on desire alone, on the woman's own wish to be thin, and that wish was powerful enough to carry the product a very long way. But desire, the sellers would learn, has a ceiling. A woman might want to be slender and still somewhere underneath suspect that smoking was not entirely good for her. To get past that suspicion, to silence the small inner voice of doubt, the campaign would eventually need something stronger than wanting. It would need authority. It would need permission from a source the woman could not easily argue with. But hold that thought, because we are not there yet, and the reach for a lucky years are worth dwelling in a little longer for what they reveal about the whole machine. Notice that the harm being done was almost invisible to the people doing it. The advertising men were not in their own minds poisoning anyone. They were solving a creative problem. They were finding the cleverest possible connection between a product and a desire, which is exactly what they had been hired and trained to do, and they were very good at it. The thought that the product itself might be quietly damaging the lungs of the women who reached for it was simply not part of the problem they had been given to solve. It lived in a different department, or no department at all. This is how large harms are so often done, you may have noticed, not in a single wicked decision, but in the gaps between many small competent ones. The man who wrote the slogan did his job. The artist who drew the slim woman and her shadow did his job. The executive who approved the campaign did his. The magazine that ran it did its job, which was to fill its pages and sell its advertising space. Each of them, asked, could have given a perfectly reasonable account of his own small part. And the sum of all those reasonable parts was a machine that taught millions of women to reach toward the very thing that would hurt them, in the name of taking care of themselves. There is no need to feel anger about this in the dark, though anger would not be wrong. It is enough for tonight simply to see it clearly, the way you might examine a strange old mechanism in a museum, turning it over, understanding how the gears fit without needing to be furious at the long-dead hands that built it. The reach for a lucky machine was beautifully made. It did exactly what it was designed to do, and it was aimed, with great precision, at one of the tenderest and most private aches a person can carry, the wish to be acceptable in one's own body. The women who reached, of course, were not statistics, though it is easy to let them become statistics at this distance. Each one was a particular person, on a particular evening, perhaps tired, perhaps a little sad, perhaps standing in a kitchen with the dishes done, and a slice of cake on a plate, and a new packet of Luckies on the counter, and a voice in her memory, supplied by a billboard, suggesting which one to choose. She chose the cigarette sometimes because she'd been taught for years that this was the disciplined thing, the modern thing, the choice that kept her from becoming the shadow looming behind her in the advertisement. She thought she was protecting herself. In the smallest and saddest sense, she'd been engineered. And yet, lying here, it is important not to let the story curdle into something bitter, because bitterness is not restful and you came here to rest. The women were not fools, the sellers were not cartoon monsters. The whole thing was simply a very ordinary collision between human longing and human cleverness. The kind of collision that has happened in every market in every age. Only here the product was unusually patient in its harm, and the longing it pressed on was unusually tender, and the cleverness aimed at it was unusually refined. It is a sad story, but it is a quiet sadness, an old sadness, the kind you can hold in your open hand and look at without flinching. What the reach for a lucky years proved, above all, was that the connection would hold. Tie the cigarette to slimness and women would come. The market that Hill had called a gold mine had been opened, exactly as he predicted, and the gold was real. But every successful campaign breeds a hunger for a more successful one, and the sellers, having proven they could sell against desire, began to wonder how much further they could push if they added something desire could not provide on its own. If wanting brought women this far, what might happen if wanting were joined to belief? What might happen if the woman reaching for the lucky could be told, by a voice she trusted absolutely, that she was not only staying slim but doing herself no harm at all? That is the door this chapter opens onto, and we will walk through it before the night is out. But not yet. For now, let the billboards fade from the roadside. Let the slim, painted women and their looming shadows dissolve back into the paper they were printed on. Let the candy makers stop their shouting and go home. The whole loud commerce of it is winding down into the dark, as all loud things do, and there is nothing left for you to do but lie still and breathe and let the quiet take the room back. Reach for a lucky instead of a sweet. 7 small words that did so much. They are harmless now, emptied of their power by time and knowledge, just a curiosity from a vanished world, a thing you can turn over once more in your mind and then set down. Set them down now. Let your hand open. Let the slogan drift off into the dark with everything else, and let yourself sink a little deeper into the warmth, while the story waits, patient as ever, to show you the next thing it has to show. It is one thing to tell a woman to reach for a cigarette instead of a sweet. It is another, larger thing to build the world in which that instruction feels like wisdom. And in the years after the first slimness campaigns, that is exactly what the sellers and the magazines and the films set about doing. Not always on purpose, not always in concert, but with a steady cumulative force, until a woman could hardly look anywhere without being reminded that her body was a problem to be managed and that the cigarette was one of the tools for managing it. Consider the looming shadow that haunted so many of those advertisements, the heavier ghost standing behind the slim and smiling woman. Avoid that future shadow, the caption murmured. It is a small image, easy to pass over, but spend a moment with it in the dark and you will see how much cruelty is folded into so few lines of ink. The message is that inside every slender woman a fatter woman is waiting, patient, inevitable, ready to emerge the moment vigilance lapses. The body is not a home. The body is a battlefield, and the enemy is the woman's own appetite, and she must never, ever rest. That is an exhausting way to live, and it was sold as liberation. The same campaigns that draped the cigarette in the language of freedom were, with their other hand, fitting women with a new and tighter kind of bondage, the endless surveillance of the self. A woman freed from the old constraint that she must not smoke was handed, in the same motion, a fresh constraint that she must not soften, must not spread, must not become the shadow. One cage was opened and another, smaller and more intimate, was closed around her, and because the new cage was made of her own desire to be admired, she often carried it without noticing it was there. The cigarette fit into this scheme with terrible neatness, because it offered itself as both the reward and the discipline at once. Light it, and you have something to do with your hands instead of reaching for food. Light it, and you have a small pleasure that the slimness rules permit. Light it, and the nervous energy that might otherwise drive you to the kitchen has somewhere else to go. The seller did not have to explain any of this. The woman, living inside the world the campaigns had built, worked it out for herself, which is always how the best-selling works. The conclusion feels like her own. There was a particular genius in aiming all of this at the body rather than at the lungs, at the visible rather than the hidden. A woman could see her figure, she could not see her lungs. The harm the cigarette did was silent and slow and invisible, accumulating in the dark interior of the chest where no mirror reached, while the benefit it promised, the slimness, was right there on the surface, available to be checked every morning and approved by every passing glance. The campaign offered a visible good against an invisible harm, and the human eye, which trusts what it can see, fell for the trade again and again. You can feel, can you not, how unfair a contest that is. On one side, the immediate, the checkable, the daily affirmation of the scale and the dress that still fits. On the other, a cost so deferred and so quiet that it would not announce itself for 30 years, by which time the connection between the cigarette of 1930 and the cough of 1960 would be almost impossible for an ordinary person to trace. The sellers did not need to hide the harm. The harm hid itself by its very nature, and all the campaign had to do was keep the eye fixed firmly on the visible prize. It helped, too, that the slimness being sold was bound up with so much else that a woman might reasonably want. To be slender, in that world, was to be modern, to be young, to be the kind of woman the films and the fashion plates approved. It was to be desirable, and desirability, in a society that gave women so little power of their own, was one of the few currencies many of them were permitted to accumulate. The cigarette, by promising to guard the figure, was not just promising a number on a scale. It was promising to protect a woman's standing, her welcome, her place. No wonder the promise found such fertile ground. Underneath all of it ran a current of fear, and fear, as every seller eventually learns, is a stronger engine than desire. Desire pulls you toward a thing. Fear pushes you away from a worse one, and the push is often harder than the pull. The future shadow in the advertisement was a fear made visible, the dread of becoming unwelcome, unadmired, unchosen. A woman might reach for a sweet out of simple desire for sugar. She would put it down out of fear of the shadow. And the cigarette stood ready, at exactly that moment of fear, offering itself as the thing that would keep the shadow at bay. None of this required the women to be vain or foolish, and it is important to say so clearly here in the quiet, because it would be easy and lazy to blame them. They were responding, sensibly enough, to the world they had been placed in. If a society spends every day telling you that your worth depends on your shape and offers you a tool that seems to protect that shape, you are not being silly to use the tool. You are doing the rational thing inside an irrational arrangement. The foolishness, if there was foolishness, belonged to the arrangement, not to the women caught inside it. And the arrangement was vast. It was not only the cigarette advertisements, it was the whole surrounding chorus, the diet columns and the corset advertisements, and the reducing salts and the rubber garments that promised to melt the figure, the endless parade of products and articles all built on the same foundational message that the female body was wrong and needed correcting. The cigarette campaign did not have to build that foundation. It simply moved into a house that was already standing, furnished and warm, and made itself comfortable among the other tenants who were all selling, in their different ways, the same anxiety back to the women who could not escape it. There is a strange and quiet horror in recognizing how seamless it all was, how 1,000 separate commercial voices, none of them coordinating, all happened to harmonize on the single note that a woman should be afraid of her own body. It was not a conspiracy. It did not need to be. The incentives all pointed the same way, the way water all runs downhill without needing to be organized, and the cigarette campaign was just one more stream joining a river that was already in flood. The river did not care about any individual woman, it only flowed. But let the river run on without you for a moment. You do not have to swim in it tonight. You can stand on the bank in the dark and simply watch it pass, this old flood of fear and selling, and understand that it was powerful, and that it was unfair, and that it is for you, in this moment, entirely harmless. The advertisements that built the world of the future shadow have all crumbled. The magazines have all yellowed. The women who lived inside that world have mostly gone, carrying their private struggles with them into the quiet where all such struggles finally rest. What the slimness machinery proved for the sellers watching their sales climb was that the connection ran even deeper than they had hoped. Women would not merely reach for the cigarette once, they would build it into the daily defense of their own bodies, weave it into the fabric of their fear until it was not a product they bought but a habit they depended on, lit at the first sign of hunger, at the first whisper of the shadow. A product woven that tightly into a person's daily fear is not easily given up. The sellers had not just opened a market, they had built a dependency, and dependency, unlike desire, does not fade. Yet even a dependency built on fear has a soft spot, and the sellers knew where it was. Underneath the fear of the shadow lay a second, quieter fear, rarely spoken, that the cigarette itself might be doing some harm, that the small white tool against the figure might be exacting a price somewhere out of sight. That fear was faint in those years, and easy to ignore, but it was there, and the next move in the long campaign would be aimed precisely at it, to reach into that second fear and smother it, not with desire, which could not touch it, but with the calm, authoritative voice of someone the woman had been raised to believe. We are nearly at the door of the doctor's office now, but first we must meet the men who learned to put words in his mouth. So let the shape of the woman go for now, the slim one and the shadow both. Let them step back into the flat paper of the old advertisements and stay there. You are not a figure to be managed tonight. You are simply a body at rest, warm under the blankets, breathing slow, owed nothing and owing nothing, exactly the right size for the space you're in. Let that be enough, let it be more than enough, and drift on, if you like, while the story walks quietly toward the next of its rooms. Behind every slogan that ever lodged itself in the public mind there is a room, and in that room there are people whose entire profession is the manufacture of belief. We have met the businessman who wanted the gold, and the theorist who understood the crowd. Now we should sit a while with the advertising men themselves, the craftsmen of persuasion, because it was in their hands that the raw wish to sell cigarettes to women was shaped into the precise instruments that did the selling. They were not the owners of the harm, they were its artisans, and artisanship, even in a bad cause, has its own quiet fascination. The greatest of them, in the world of Lucky Strike, was a man named Albert Lasker, who ran a famous advertising agency, and who is sometimes called the father of modern advertising itself. Lasker had a conviction that set him apart from the older men of his trade. He believed that an advertisement should not merely announce that a product existed. It should give a reason to buy, planted in the customer's mind so firmly that it felt like the customer's own conclusion. Salesmanship in print, he called it. Not decoration, not poetry. Persuasion with a purpose. Every word chosen to move a hand toward a purchase. Under that philosophy, an advertisement became a kind of machine, and like all machines, it could be refined. Lasker and the men who worked in his tradition tested their words, watched which ones moved product and which ones fell flat, and learned, over thousands of campaigns, the deep grammar of how a public could be nudged. They learned that a reason, even a flimsy one, outsold a mere boast. They learned that fear moved people faster than hope. They learned that a familiar authority, borrowed and pointed at the product, could carry a claim that the product could never have carried on its own. They were, in their way, scientists of wanting, running their endless experiments on the open population. It was within this tradition that the cigarette campaigns grew so sophisticated. The men in the room did not ask, "Is this true?" That was not the question their trade had trained them to ask. They asked, "Will this work? Will this arrangement of words and images move the most hands toward the most packages?" And if the answer was yes, the campaign ran, regardless of whether the reason it offered was solid or hollow, regardless of whether the women it moved were being helped or harmed. The harm was simply not on the worksheet. The worksheet had one column, and the column was sales. You may feel, lying here, that this is a damning thing to say about a whole profession, and perhaps it is. But it is worth being fair, because fairness is more restful than outrage, and closer to the truth besides. The advertising men did not invent the human wish to be slender, or the human trust in doctors, or the human tendency to follow the crowd. They found those things already present, deep features of the people they were selling to, and they built their machines to fit. A locksmith who makes a key that fits a lock did not make the lock. The advertising men made keys, brilliant keys, for locks that human nature had already installed. And the particular key they would eventually cut, the one this whole night is circling toward, was the testimonial, the endorsement, the voice of a trusted figure, placed beside the product, vouching for it. Lasker and his fellows understood the testimonial's power long before they aimed it at the doctor. They used opera singers, who vouched that the cigarette did not harm the precious voice. They used athletes, actors, society women, anyone whose word carried weight with some slice of the public. The structure was always the same. Find a voice the customer already believes, pay for it, or arrange for it, or simply gather it, then let that borrowed belief do the work the product could not do for itself. There is a moment in the history of every testimonial campaign where the line between honest endorsement and manufactured one grows very thin, and the cigarette men walked that line with great skill. Sometimes the endorser truly used the product and truly liked it, or believed she did. Sometimes the endorsement was bought outright, a fee paid for a famous name beside the package. And sometimes, in the cleverest cases, the endorsement was engineered, the conditions arranged so that a technically true statement could be harvested and displayed in a way that implied far more than it said. We will see that last technique in its full flower when we reach the doctors. For now, notice only that the machinery for it was already built, already tested, already humming, waiting for its most powerful application. It is worth dwelling, too, on how the advertising men thought about the women they were selling to, because their private language, where it survives, is not flattering and not meant to be kind. The customer, in that worldview, was not quite a person. She was a target, a market, a set of buttons to be pressed in the correct sequence to produce the desired behaviour. This is not because the advertising men were monsters. It is because their trade required them to see people as mechanisms, since a mechanism can be designed for and a person, in all her unrepeatable particularity, cannot. To sell at scale, you must stop seeing the individual, and once you have stopped seeing her, a great many things become easy that should have stayed hard. That is perhaps the quietest and most important lesson buried in this chapter, and you may hold it as lightly as you like. Large harms are made possible by the conversion of persons into categories. The woman reaching for the lucky was, to herself, a whole life, a particular evening, a real and specific fear. To the men who built the campaign that moved her hand, she was a percentage point, a conversion rate, a number that went up when the right words were chosen. Neither view was false, exactly. But only one of them could be cruel without feeling cruel, and that was the view from the room where the words were made. The advertising men prospered. Their agencies grew rich on tobacco accounts, and tobacco was, for decades, among the most lucrative business an agency could have. The cigarette companies spent vast sums, year after year, and that money flowed into the agencies and paid for the offices and the salaries and the comfortable lives of the men who made the words. This too is part of the machinery, and not the least part. A great deal of cleverness was bent towards selling cigarettes because a great deal of money was paid to bend it. Persuasion, like water, tends to flow toward where the funds are deepest, and for half a century the funds were deepest in tobacco. It would be comforting to imagine that somewhere in those agencies a man stood up and refused, said that he would not lend his craft to this, walked out into the daylight with his conscience intact. No doubt here and there a few did. But the structure did not depend on any single man, and it could absorb the loss of the squeamish ones without slowing down. There was always another writer who needed the work, another artist who could draw the slim woman and her shadow, another executive untroubled by the question of whether the reason in the advertisement was true. The machine did not require wicked men. It required only enough ordinary ones, and ordinary men, history shows, are never in short supply. Let the agencies fade now, the busy rooms, the men at their desks cutting their brilliant keys for the locks of human nature. They worked hard. They were good at what they did. And what they did, in the end, was build the delivery system for a promise that would sicken the people who believed it, all without any one of them ever quite holding the harm in his own two hands. It is a strange kind of guilt, distributed so thinly across so many that no single person carries enough of it to feel its full weight. Strange and very modern, and worth understanding but not worth losing sleep over. You came here to find sleep, not to lose it. So set the advertising men down gently among the others we have met. The businessman, the theorist, the craftsman of belief. Together they had built everything except the final piece, the most powerful endorser of all, the one whose word could silence the last small doubt in a woman's mind. They had used singers and athletes and society beauties. But there was one voice left, the most trusted voice in modern life, and the campaign had been moving toward it from the beginning. The door to the doctor's office is just ahead now. We can see the light under it. But there is no need to open it this very minute. The hallway outside is dim and quiet, and you can rest here a moment before we go in. Feel how far we have come already, through the world before, through the gold mine and the torches and the sweet, through the shadow and the room where the words were made. It has been a long, gentle walk, and you have followed it well, or you have drifted off somewhere along the way, which is just as good. Either way, the next room will be waiting. Doors in a story like this never lock. Breathe out, slow and long. Let the hallway grow softer at its edges. The men who made the words have all gone home for the night, 100 years ago, to lives and dinners and beds of their own, and they cannot reach you here. Only the story remains, patient in the dark, holding the door. When you're ready, or when you're nearly asleep, we will step through it together and meet, at last, the doctor, whose good name was about to be spent. Before the doctor was ever invited into the advertisement, the cigarette had already begun to dress itself in the language of health, quietly, almost shyly, testing how much medical costume it could wear before anyone objected. The first garment it tried on was a phrase so small and so clever that it ran on Lucky Strike packages for decades and is remembered still. It is toasted. 2 words, faintly scientific, faintly reassuring, suggesting some careful process, some refinement, some attention to the well-being of the person who would breathe the smoke. It is toasted, as though the tobacco had been gently prepared for you, like bread. What the phrase actually referred to was a real enough step in the manufacture, a heating of the tobacco. But that is not what it was for. It was for the feeling it left behind, the impression of something wholesome and considered, the sense that this cigarette, unlike some careless other, had been made with your throat in mind. The genius lay in saying something technically true, in a way that implied a benefit it never named. It is toasted. Toasted against what? For what purpose? The phrase did not say, and did not need to. The listener's own hopeful mind filled in a meaning far kinder than the words deserved. From there the claims grew bolder, and they clustered tellingly around the throat. Lucky Strike promised that its toasting protected against throat irritation, against the cough, against the rough catch that even smokers knew the cigarette could leave behind. No throat irritation, the advertisements declared. Less irritating, easy on the throat. And to vouch for it, the campaign reached for a particular kind of endorser, one whose value depended entirely on the health of the very organ in question. They reached for singers. They reached for the great voices of the opera and the stage, whose careers lived or died by the condition of their throats, and who therefore made the perfect witnesses for a cigarette that claimed to do the throat no harm. Picture the logic from the listener's side, because it is beautifully constructed. Here is a celebrated soprano, a woman whose voice is her fortune, her gift, the thing that fills great halls and earns her fame. If anyone in the world has a reason to guard her throat, it is she. And here she is, in the advertisement, with a lucky strike, vouching that it does her precious voice no harm. The reasoning writes itself. If it is safe for her throat, the most valuable and most carefully protected throat imaginable, then surely it is safe for mine. The endorsement does not argue. It simply stands there, radiant and famous, and lets the listener arrive at the comfortable conclusion on her own. Whether the singers truly believed the cigarettes did their voices no harm is one of those questions that dissolves in the distance of years. Some were paid, some perhaps did smoke and had not yet felt the cost. Some may have believed it sincerely, since the harm was slow, and the science was young, and the whole culture was telling them the same reassuring story. The point for the campaign was never the inner truth of the endorser's belief. The point was the borrowed authority, the transfer of trust from a figure the public admired to a product the public might fear. The singer lent her credibility, and the cigarette wore it like a borrowed coat. It is worth noticing how each of these moves, the toasting, the throat protection, the singers, was a step closer to the world of medicine without quite entering it. The throat is a part of the body. Irritation is a bodily complaint. To claim a cigarette is easy on the throat is to make a quasi-medical claim, a claim about what the product does to flesh, even if no doctor has yet been summoned to confirm it. The campaign was learning, step by careful step, that the public would accept claims about its health from the cigarette, that the appetite for reassurance on this exact point was bottomless. Every reassurance sold. The only question left was how far the reassurance could be pushed, and who could be found to push it furthest. And there, at the edge of the throat claims, the answer became obvious. If the singer's endorsement was powerful because she guarded her throat for a living, how much more powerful would the endorsement be from the one figure in all of society whose entire purpose was the guarding of health itself? The singer guarded one throat, her own. The doctor guarded everyone's and was trusted to. If the campaign could move from the soprano to the physician, from the famous voice to the white coat, it would have reached the summit of borrowed authority, the highest and most trusted endorser the human world had to offer. There was nowhere further up to climb. You can feel the campaign gathering itself for that final ascent. Every move so far had prepared the ground. The slimness had opened the market. The freedom had cracked the shame. The toasting and the throat claims had taught the public to accept health reassurance from the cigarette itself. The testimonial machinery had been built and tested on singers and athletes and society women. All of it pointed upward, toward the doctor, the one endorser who could not be topped, whose word on a matter of health was, in the mind of the ordinary person, very nearly the last word there was. It is a sobering thing in the quiet to watch a profession's good name being measured up like a piece of cloth, considered for how well it might be cut and worn by something that would harm the very people who trusted it. The doctor had earned that trust across a long, hard century of real progress, of fevers conquered and pain eased and lives that would once have ended now saved. The trust was a genuine treasure, perhaps the most genuine treasure the modern world had produced, and the campaign looked at that treasure the way Hill had looked at the market, as a thing lying in the open, waiting only to be picked up. But it would be wrong, and not quite restful, to imagine that the doctors were simply victims of all this, their trust stolen from them without their knowledge. That is part of the truth, but only part. The harder and sadder part is that the profession, in many cases, lent itself. Doctors accepted the free cartons. Doctors posed for the advertisements. Doctors smoked themselves, in great numbers, and saw no contradiction in vouching for what they personally enjoyed. The medical journals carried the cigarette advertisements and cashed the checks. The trust was not only stolen, in 1,000 small transactions it was also, quietly, sold. And we will have to look at that clearly, gently, before the night is through. For now, though, we're still in the antechamber, among the toasting and the throat claims and the famous singers with their guarded voices. It is a strange and ornate little room, this one, full of half-medical language and borrowed glamour, and it is the last room before the real one. Beyond it lies the doctor's office, where the campaign will make its highest and most fateful claim, the claim that medicine itself stood behind the cigarette. We are almost there. The light under that door is brighter now and steadier, and we will walk into it soon. Let the singers take their bows and leave the stage. Let the great halls go dark and empty. The voices that filled them have all fallen silent now, every one, the way all voices eventually do, and the cigarettes they vouched for have crumbled to nothing along with the hands that held them. It is toasted, the packages said, for 50 years, and now even that small clever phrase has gone quiet, retired, a curiosity from a vanished trade. You can let it go. You can let all of it go, the toasting and the throats and the famous sopranos, and sink a little deeper into the dark. There is nothing left in this room that needs you awake. The claims have all expired. The endorsements have all dissolved. The whole ornate antechamber is empty now except for the patient story, holding the last door, waiting to show you what lay beyond it. You do not have to see it tonight. The story will still be standing there, holding that door, whenever you come back, tomorrow or the next night or never. It does not mind waiting. Waiting is most of what a story does. So breathe and rest and let the antechamber soften and fade. You have walked a long way through this strange old building, room by quiet room, and you have earned whatever sleep is finding you now. The doctor's office is just ahead, but it is not going anywhere, and neither are you. Stay here in the warm dark as long as you like. The brightest and saddest room in the whole story can wait one more breath. It can wait as many breaths as you need. The door opens at last onto a number. 20,679 physicians say Lucky's are less irritating. That was the claim, printed boldly across the advertisements in the early 1930s, and it is worth saying the number aloud in the quiet, slowly, because the precision of it was the whole trick. Not 20,000. Not about 20,000. 20,679, a figure so exact that it carried the smell of a ledger, of a careful count, of science. A round number invites doubt. A precise one invites belief. The campaign had learned that, and it chose its digits with care. Now ask the question the advertisement did not want you to ask. How does a cigarette company come to possess the opinion of 20,679 physicians? Did the doctors write in, unprompted, to share their views on which cigarette least irritated the throat? They did not. The method, when you trace it back, is a small masterpiece of engineered endorsement. The technique we saw forming in the testimonial chapter, now applied to the most trusted profession of all. The company simply gave the cigarettes away to doctors in great numbers, and then asked a question carefully shaped to harvest the answer it had already decided to print. The mechanism worked something like this. Cartons of Lucky Strikes were sent to physicians, free, a small professional courtesy, a gift, and along with the gift, or soon after, came a query, framed just so. Did the doctor find these cigarettes less irritating? Not, are cigarettes safe? Not, do you recommend smoking? Simply, of the cigarettes you might smoke, is this one less harsh on the throat? A doctor handed a free carton, asked only whether this particular smoke felt smoother than some other, might well answer yes, or might simply not answer no. And from that thin and narrow agreement the campaign built its towering claim. 20,000 physicians say. Notice the sleight of hand, because it is the same sleight that runs through this entire history. The doctor was never asked to endorse smoking. He was asked at most to compare one cigarette to another on the single narrow axis of throat irritation after being handed the product for free. His answer, whatever it was, said nothing whatsoever about whether the cigarette was good for him, or safe, or wise. But the advertisement did not print the narrow question. It printed only the wide, warm impression, 20,000 physicians say Lucky's are less irritating, and it let the public hear in those words what the public wanted to hear, which was that doctors, the guardians of health, had looked at this cigarette and approved. This is the precise point in the long story where the trust began to be spent, and it is worth lingering here, gently, in the dim light, because everything else flows from it. Up to now, the campaign had borrowed authority from singers and athletes, from people whose word carried weight but whose expertise was not in health. Now it reached for the one authority whose entire meaning was health, and it cut that authority to fit the product by the simplest possible means, by giving away free samples and asking a question narrow enough to produce a usable answer. The doctor's judgment, the most valuable judgment in the modern world, was acquired wholesale, by the carton, at the cost of the cigarettes themselves. And here is the part that should give even a sleepy mind a moment's pause. Many of the doctors who answered were not being bribed in any way they would have recognised as bribery. A free carton is a small thing. A narrow question about throat comfort is an easy thing to answer. No physician, accepting the gift and offering the mild reply, would have felt himself to be selling his profession's good name. The transaction was too small, too ordinary, to feel like corruption. And yet, multiplied by 20,000 and printed beneath a precise and weighty number, those small ordinary replies became a vast and false impression of medical endorsement. The corruption was real. It was simply divided into pieces too small for any single doctor to feel. This is perhaps the deepest lesson the whole night has to offer, and you may hold it as loosely as a half-dream. A great betrayal of trust need not feel like betrayal to any of the people committing it. It can be assembled out of acts so minor that each participant feels innocent. A free carton here, a mild answer there, a cheque cashed by a journal, a photograph posed for an afternoon. No one of these is a crime. No one of these keeps a person awake at night. But gather enough of them, point them all in the same direction, and you have built something monstrous out of materials that were each, on their own, almost weightless. The cigarette companies understood this. It was the secret of their whole method. The advertisements with their precise physician counts ran and ran, and they worked. They worked because they answered the one fear that desire alone could never reach, the quiet suspicion in the back of a smoker's mind that the cigarette might be doing harm. To that suspicion the advertisement offered the calmest possible reply. 20,000 doctors have considered it. 20,000 guardians of your health have found this one less irritating. Whatever small worry you carry, lay it down, for the men who would know best have looked, and they are not worried. It was a lullaby sung to the smoker's conscience, and like all good lullabies, it asked her to stop thinking and simply rest. Of course, the claim that one cigarette was less irritating than another, even if it were perfectly true, said nothing at all about whether smoking was safe. A slightly smoother poison is still a poison. But the advertisement did not invite that thought, and the human mind, offered a comforting authority, rarely goes looking for the uncomfortable distinction on its own. The doctors had spoken, or seemed to have spoken, and that was enough. The narrow truth about throat comfort was allowed to stand in for the broad question of harm, and the broad question, unasked, went quietly back to sleep. It would be some years yet before the very fullest form of this strategy arrived, the famous campaign in which one company would claim that more doctors smoked its brand than any other, harvested by an even cleverer method at the doctor's own conventions. We will come to that, and it is in some ways the dark jewel of the whole collection. But the groundwork was laid here, in the early 30s, with the 20,000 and the precise odd number, and the free cartons and the narrow harvesting question. The form was set. The trust had been tapped. The rest was only refinement, only the perfecting of a technique that had already been proven to work. Lie with that for a moment, the image of those free cartons going out into the world, to doctors' offices across the country, each one a tiny invitation to lend, without quite noticing, a sliver of the profession's good name. Some doctors threw them away, some smoked them and said nothing, some answered the question and forgot they had. And from all those scattered small moments the campaign gathered its towering false impression, the way a great drift of snow is gathered from countless weightless flakes, no one of which could ever bury anything, all of which together could bury a house. There is no anger required here, only clarity, and clarity is restful in its own way. You can see the whole mechanism now, laid open in the dim light, and seeing it clearly is enough. The free gift, the narrow question, the precise number, the wide false impression, the small acts too minor to feel like corruption, summed into a betrayal too large to undo. It is an old machine, long since shut down, its parts rusted and still. You can examine it without fear, turn it over in your mind, understand exactly how it worked, and then set it down and let it be. Set it down now. The free cartons have all been smoked or thrown away 90 years ago and more. The doctors who answered the narrow question have all gone to their rest. The advertisements with their precise and weighty numbers have crumbled into the dust of old magazines. Nothing of that machine can reach you in this dark, warm room, where you owe no one an endorsement and nothing asks for your trust, and the only number that matters is the slow, soft count of your own breathing. So count it if you like, that slow, soft number in and out, and let the 20,000 physicians fade. They were only ever a number on a page, and the page is gone. You are real, and present, and warm, and the story will hold its shape until you wish to return to it. The next room, where the doctors step out of the small print and into the very centre of the advertisement, in their white coats, with their reassuring smiles, can wait. It has waited 90 years. It can wait one more breath, or 1,000 while you drift. You. For a while the doctor lived only in the small print, a number, a reported opinion, a presence felt but not quite seen. Then he stepped into the picture. By the later 1930s and into the 40s, the physician was no longer merely quoted in the cigarette advertisements. He was shown. There he stood, in the photograph or the painting, in his white coat, perhaps with a stethoscope draped around his neck, perhaps seated at a desk with the calm, competent air of a man who has just delivered good news, and in his hand, or near it, the cigarette. The image did the arguing now, and images argue faster and deeper than words, slipping past the guard that words sometimes raise. Consider what the white coat does to the eye before a single word is read. It signals cleanliness, expertise, the careful objective world of the laboratory and the clinic. It is the uniform of a person who knows things about your body that you do not, and who has dedicated his life to keeping that body well. When the coat appears beside the cigarette, the meaning transfers without anyone deciding to let it. The cleanliness of the coat rubs off on the smoke. The expertise of the man rubs off on the product. The eye does the work the advertiser wants done, and does it instantly, and does it below the level where the mind might object. Often the doctor in the advertisement was not a real, named, practicing physician at all, but a model dressed as one, or a generic figure, the idea of a doctor rather than any particular man. This made the technique even cleverer, because the idea of a doctor carries all the trust of the profession, with none of the inconvenient specificity of a person who might be asked to defend his words. The figure could say whatever the campaign needed, vouch for whatever it wished to vouch for, because he was no one, and no one cannot be cross-examined. The white coat spoke with the borrowed voice of every doctor at once, and answered to none of them. Sometimes the claims placed beside the white-coated figure were about the throat, the old reliable ground. Sometimes they ventured further. A particular brand might be shown as the one doctors recommended for the nerves, or for digestion, or simply as the smoker physician himself would choose at the end of a long day caring for others. The implication, always, was that the man who knew the body best had considered the cigarette, and found it not merely harmless but positively congenial, a small, civilized pleasure that a person of science could enjoy without a second thought. If he was not worried, the image whispered, why on earth should you be? It is worth pausing, in the quiet, on how perfectly this answered the deepest need of the anxious smoker, and especially the anxious woman smoker the campaigns had worked so hard to create. She had been taught to fear the shadow, to reach for the cigarette against her appetite, to weave it into the daily defence of her figure. But underneath, the small doubt persisted, the wordless worry that the thing she leaned on might be costing her something she could not see. The white coat reached precisely into that doubt and stilled it. A doctor smokes. A doctor recommends. The body's own appointed guardian is untroubled. And so the woman could lay down even that last quiet worry and reach for the cigarette with a conscience finally, fully at rest. That is what the white coat was for, not to inform but to permit, not to tell the smoker anything true, but to grant her the one thing she could not grant herself, which was permission to stop worrying. Permission is among the most valuable things one human being can give another, and the cigarette companies had found a way to manufacture it at scale, to print it 1,000,000 times over, to hang it on roadside boards and slide it between the pages of every magazine a woman might open. The white coat sold permission, and permission, it turns out, sells better than almost anything. There is something almost tender, and therefore almost unbearable, in imagining the woman who received that permission and was grateful for it. She did not want to be harming herself. She did not want to be foolish. She wanted, like all of us, to be doing the right thing, or at least not the wrong one, and the white coat told her she was fine. It told her in the gentlest, most authoritative voice the culture possessed. And she believed it, because believing it let her rest, and because the man in the coat had been her whole life, the one figure she had been taught she could believe. Her trust was not a flaw, it was the most reasonable thing about her, and it was used. We should be careful, though, even here, not to let the doctors off too easily by pretending the white coat in the advertisements was always a hollow costume worn by a paid model. Real physicians did lend themselves, in various ways, across these decades, and we'll look at that complicity squarely in the chapters ahead. But the generic white-coated figure tells us something on its own, something about how the profession's authority had become a kind of free-floating asset, detached from any individual doctor, available to be worn by anyone the campaign chose to dress. The trust had grown so large and so general that it could be borrowed without anyone's particular permission. It belonged to everyone, which is another way of saying it could be taken by anyone. And so, the cigarette, which had begun the century as a coarse vice forbidden to respectable women, now sat in the painted hand of a painted doctor, gleaming with all the borrowed authority of modern medicine, offered to those same women as a thing their own physician would smile upon. The journey was complete, from forbidden to prescribed, or near enough to prescribed that the difference hardly mattered to the eye that took it in over breakfast. It had taken only a few decades, a few brilliant men, a great deal of money, and the quiet spending of a trust that had taken a century to build. It is worth pausing too on how carefully the figure was composed, for nothing in those images was accidental. The angle of the head suggesting attention and care, the instrument worn or held suggesting competence, the steady gaze suggesting honesty. Every detail was chosen to summon, in the viewer, the particular feeling of being in the presence of a person who could be trusted with one's health, and that feeling, once summoned, attached itself to the cigarette in the figure's hand. The woman looking at the advertisement did not reason her way to trust. She felt it all at once from the composed image, before any argument was made, and the feeling did the work that no argument could have done. And because the trust was a feeling rather than a conclusion, it could not easily be argued away. A woman who had reasoned herself into believing the cigarette safe might later reason herself out of it, given new facts. But a woman who simply felt, looking at the calm white-coated figure, that the cigarette belonged to the world of medicine and care, carried that feeling beneath the level of argument where new facts could not easily reach it. This is why the image was so much more powerful than any words could have been, and why the companies invested so heavily in getting it exactly right. They were not persuading the mind, they were arranging a feeling, and feelings, once arranged, are slow to come undone. Let the white-coated figure stand there a moment longer in the dim light of your mind, calm and competent and entirely invented, holding out his permission to a woman who needed it and could not know how little it was worth. Then let him fade, as he has long since faded, back into the old paper, back into the vanished magazines, back into the strange archive of things the world once believed and no longer does. He cannot reach you. His permission means nothing now. The only permission that matters tonight is the one you can give yourself, which is permission to stop following the story and simply sleep. Take that permission. You have earned it. You have walked a long way through this old building, room after quiet room, and you have seen the white coat now, the bright centre of the whole machine, and you do not need to see anything more tonight if you do not wish to. The story will keep its shape. The next rooms where the doctors of flesh and blood stepped forward, and the great convention floor deception was perfected, will be waiting, patient and unhurried, whenever you return. Breathe out long and slow and let the white coat dissolve. Let the calm invented doctor put away his calm invented cigarette and step back into nothing, which is where he came from. The room goes dim. The story sets down its argument and waits, and you, warm and real and owed nothing, drift on toward whatever sleep is gathering at the edges of the dark, while the building stands quiet around you, holding all its rooms, in no hurry at all. We're about halfway through the night now, and if you're still here, still listening, thank you for staying. If it has helped you soften towards sleep even a little, that is the whole purpose, and you might let the channel know by subscribing, so the next quiet story finds its way to you when you want it. But only if it suits you. There is no pressure here, only the slow unwinding of the dark and the story, which will carry on softly whether you follow it or let it go. Rest now. We have a few rooms left and none of them are in any hurry. Of all the claims the cigarette companies ever made, one stands above the rest, not because it was the boldest, but because it was the most beautifully engineered, the most perfect marriage of true words and false impression. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. It belonged to a rival company, the makers of Camel, and it ran through the middle and later 1940s and into the early 50s, and for a time it was nearly everywhere. More doctors smoke Camels. Read it again in the quiet and feel how it lands. It does not say Camels are safe. It does not say doctors recommend smoking. It says only that more doctors, the men who know, choose this brand, and it lets you draw every comforting conclusion yourself. The claim was, in the narrowest sense, defensible, which is what made it so dangerous. The company really did conduct surveys. It really did ask doctors which cigarette they smoked. And in those surveys, Camel really did come out ahead. So the words could not easily be called a lie. They could be defended in any argument by pointing to the surveys, the data, the apparent rigour of it all. But the rigour was a costume, and underneath the costume the whole thing was hollow, because of how the surveys were conducted, and that method is one of the quiet masterpieces of this entire history. Here is how it worked, and it is worth telling slowly. The company would send representatives to the great medical conventions, the gatherings where physicians came together by the thousands to learn and to mingle, and at those conventions the representatives would hand out cigarettes, free Camels by the carton distributed generously to the assembled doctors. The doctors, away from home, sociable, glad of a free smoke, took them and lit them. And then, a short while later, the surveyors would move among those same doctors and ask the question, "Which cigarette do you smoke?" And a great many of them, holding the free Camel they had just been given, naturally answered, "Camel." Sit with the elegance of it, in the dark, the way you might admire the workings of a trap that is no longer set. The survey was not falsified. The doctors were not paid to lie. They were simply handed the answer, in the form of a free cigarette, moments before being asked the question. The company manufactured the very preference it then went out and measured. It is a closed loop, a snake swallowing its own tail, a result produced and harvested in a single motion, and then printed, with perfect technical honesty, across a nation. More doctors smoked Camels. They did that week at that convention, because the men from Camel had just given them the Camels they were smoking. And once again, notice what the doctors were and were not doing. They were not endorsing smoking. They were not telling the public anything. They were attending a conference, accepting a free cigarette, answering a casual question. No single doctor, in that moment, was committing any sin he could have named. He was being mildly sociable, mildly thrifty, mildly truthful. And from 10,000 such small, innocent moments, the company assembled a towering claim that placed the entire authority of the medical profession behind a particular brand of cigarette. The betrayal again was divided into pieces too small for any one man to feel its weight. That was always the method. It never changed. The advertisements that carried the claim leaned hard on the figure of the doctor naturally. They showed him in his white coat, busy and competent, reaching for his Camel between patients, choosing, like the discerning man of science he was, the brand that more of his colleagues preferred. Some versions added a further flourish, the suggestion that a doctor, who could smoke any cigarette he liked and who knew more than anyone about the body, had weighed them all and landed on this one. What better recommendation could there be? The man with the most knowledge and the freest choice picks Camel. Surely, the advertisement whispered, you should too. It is hard, lying here, not to feel the particular sadness of how well this worked, on exactly the people it was built to reassure. The smoker who worried whether smoking was wise was told that the wisest people smoked, and smoked this very brand, and worried not at all. The reassurance was total. It came wrapped in the appearance of data, of surveys, of science, the very things a careful person might reach for to check a worry. The campaign had anticipated the careful person, and built a costume of rigour precisely to disarm her. She thought she was being shown evidence. She was being shown a free cigarette handed out at a convention and counted on its way back. There was a deeper cruelty still in aiming this at the doctors themselves, who were, after all, smoking in great numbers in those years, just like everyone else, and who would, in great numbers, sicken and die of it, just like everyone else. The campaign did not only use the doctors, it used them and harmed them in the same gesture, handing them the free cartons that fed both the survey and the habit, building the brand's authority on the bodies of the very men whose authority it borrowed. The doctor in the advertisement, reaching for his camel between patients, was not only a prop. He was often a real man with a real habit that would, in time, do to him exactly what it did to those who trusted him. We should not pretend the doctors were wholly blameless in this, and the Knight has promised to look at their complicity squarely. They accepted the free cartons, they smoked at the conventions. The profession as a whole was slow, shamefully slow, to speak against a habit that its own emerging research was beginning to indict. But the convention floor survey shows, better than almost anything, how a profession's good name could be spent without the profession ever quite deciding to spend it. No medical association voted to endorse Camel. No physician signed his name to the national claim. The endorsement was assembled, behind their backs and out of their own small ordinary actions, by men who understood exactly what they were doing while the doctors for the most part did not. More doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette. The claim ran for years and sold uncounted millions of packages, and it stands now as a kind of monument to a particular genius, the genius of producing a true statement that creates an entirely false belief. It is the dark jewel of this whole collection, and you can turn it over once more in the dim light and see how every facet was cut to catch the eye and mislead it. The survey, the convention, the free carton, the narrow question, the white coat, the towering printed claim, every piece honest in isolation, the whole thing a lie. But the trap is sprung now and rusted and harmless. The conventions where the free camels were handed out have long since ended. The doctors who smoked them at the buffet tables are gone. The surveys are dust, the advertisements are dust. The whole closed loop of manufactured preference has wound down into the stillness, where all such machinery eventually stops. You can look at it without being caught by it. You can understand it completely and owe it nothing. The men from Camel are not coming to this room with their free cartons. There is no question for you to answer here, no preference to be planted, nothing at all to be measured on its way back. So let the convention floor empty out. Let the surveyors pack up their clipboards and go. Let the free cartons dissolve along with the hands that took them, and the white-coated men reaching for their camels between patients fade back into the old yellowed paper where they have rested for 70 years. There is nothing here that needs you awake. The dark jewel has been examined, turned over, set down. You may set yourself down too, into the warmth, into the quiet, and let the slow tide of sleep carry you wherever it is going. The story will keep, it always keeps. There is a quieter room in this building, away from the bright billboards and the famous slogans, and we should step into it now, because it holds a part of the story that is easy to miss and impossible to forget once seen. It is a library of a sort, lined with the bound volumes of the great medical journals, the very publications in which physicians read the latest findings of their science, the trusted records of what medicine knew. And there, between the articles on surgery and pharmacology and the treatment of disease, page after page, year after year, ran the advertisements for cigarettes. Think about what that placement meant, for it was not an accident and it was not nothing. A doctor, opening his professional journal to keep current with his science, would turn from a study of the lungs to a full-page advertisement urging him to smoke a particular brand, often featuring in a closed and dizzying loop a doctor doing exactly that. The cigarette advertisement did not merely appear in the popular magazines, where one might expect persuasion. It appeared inside the temple of medical knowledge itself, sanctioned by its presence there, lent the gravity of the publication that carried it. If the journal accepted the advertisement, the reasoning went, surely the product could not be so very bad. The journals accepted those advertisements because the advertisements paid, and the journals, like all publications, needed money to run. The tobacco companies were generous and reliable advertisers, and their money helped sustain the very organs of medical communication. This is the institutional complicity at the heart of the matter, and it is worth naming plainly, gently, without heat. The medical profession did not only fail to warn the public in time. Through its own publications, it took the cigarette industry's money and carried the cigarette industry's message directly to its own members for decades. The trust was not only borrowed from the doctors, it was, in this room, sold by the institutions that were supposed to guard it. The professional associations, too, moved slowly and ambiguously through these years. There were arrangements, in various periods, by which products might display a kind of approval, a seal, a notice that they had been examined and found acceptable, and the lines around what such approval meant were not always as bright as the public assumed. Even where no formal endorsement of cigarettes existed, the general posture of the great medical bodies, for a long and consequential time, was not the ringing alarm one might hope for in hindsight. It was something closer to silence, or to caution, or to the slow institutional throat-clearing of a profession, reluctant to condemn a habit that so many of its own members shared. It would be unjust to paint this as simple greed, though greed was surely in the room. The deeper truth is gentler and sadder. The harm of tobacco was genuinely slow to prove, the science genuinely young, and the habit genuinely universal, woven into the daily life of doctors and patients alike. A profession is made of people, and people do not easily condemn a pleasure they themselves enjoy on the strength of evidence that is still emerging, when condemning it would mean upending the ordinary comfortable assumptions of their whole society. The silence of the journals and the associations was not mostly a wicked silence. It was a human one, the silence of people who did not want to know what they were beginning to be able to know. That is perhaps the most haunting kind of complicity, the kind that requires no villainy, only reluctance. No one in the medical institutions had to decide to help the cigarette companies. They had only to not look too hard, to keep accepting the advertising revenue, to keep their criticism cautious and their alarms muted, to let the comfortable assumptions stand a little longer than the evidence warranted. And the cigarette companies asked for nothing more than that. They did not need the profession to actively lie. They needed only its hesitation, its slowness, its understandable human wish that the troubling thing not be true. And for a long time, they got it. Meanwhile, the advertisements in the journals did their quiet double work. They reassured the doctors who read them that the habit they shared was sanctioned, ordinary, nothing to brood over, and they could be cited, or simply pointed to, as further evidence of medicine's comfort with the cigarette. The whole arrangement fed itself. The doctors smoked, reassured in part by their own journals. The journals carried the advertisements, funded in part by the companies whose habit the doctors shared. The companies built their public claims on the doctor's apparent comfort. Round and round it went, each part lending plausibility to the next, a machine that needed no one to push it because every part was pushing every other. Eventually, as we will see, the medical journals did turn. As the evidence grew undeniable, the most respected of them stopped accepting cigarette advertising, in a decision that was itself a small turning point in the larger story. But that came late, after years in which the pages of medicine had carried, uncomplaining, the message of the very industry its science would ultimately convict. The turning, when it came, was a kind of confession, an admission that the long acceptance had been a mistake. But the confession could not unprint the decades of advertisements, or unreassure the doctors who had read them, or call back the trust those pages had quietly conferred. Lie still with the image of that library, the bound volumes on their shelves, the cigarette advertisements waiting inside them between the studies of disease. It is a strange and quiet monument, more troubling in its way than any billboard, because the billboard at least never pretended to be anything but persuasion, while the journal was supposed to be a place of truth. To find the advertisement nested there, inside the truth, wearing the truth's authority, is to understand how thoroughly the trust had been infiltrated, how deep into the heart of the profession the borrowing had reached. But the library is dark now, and the volumes are closed, and the advertisements sleep inside them where no one reads them anymore. The journals long ago made their turn, refused the money, printed the warnings, became again, mostly, what they were meant to be. The room can be left behind. You do not have to carry its sadness into your sleep. It is enough to have seen it, to understand that the complicity reached even here, into the quietest and most trusted room of all, and then to close the door softly and walk on. Close it now in your mind, that library door, gently, the way you would close the door of a room where someone is finally resting after a long illness. The harm done in there is old and settled. The institutions have reckoned with it, imperfectly, slowly, but truly enough. And you, in your warm, dark room, far from all of it, owe those old-bound volumes nothing. Not your worry, not your anger, not your wakefulness. Let them sleep on their shelves. Let yourself sleep too. It is worth holding before we leave the library the simple strangeness of what those pages represented. The cigarette advertised in the very journals where the early evidence of its harm was beginning, quietly, to appear. For a time, the two things sat together in the same volumes, sometimes nearly the same issues, the bright commercial promise and the first sober findings, side by side, as though the profession itself had not yet decided which of them to believe. That uneasy coexistence could not last, and it did not. But while it lasted, it was a perfect small portrait of the whole long moment, the truth and the selling bound into the same pages, waiting to see which would win. The next room is brighter and stranger, and aimed once more directly at the women the whole campaign was built to capture, at the particular promises made to them about their nerves and their figures and their secret daily fears. We will step into it soon. But there is no need to hurry from the quiet of the library. Rest a while in this hush among the closed books. The story will wait here with you, patient as the volumes on the shelves, until you are ready, or until sleep decides the matter for you, which is just as well and perhaps better. Let us come back now to the woman at the centre of it all, because for all the talk of doctors and surveys and journals, she was the prize the whole machine had been built to win, and the claims aimed at her were the most carefully tuned of any. The men who made the words understood her supposed life in great detail, or believed they did. They knew, or assumed, that she carried a particular cluster of worries, and they shaped the cigarette into the answer for each one in turn, until the small white object in her hand seemed to address nearly everything that troubled her. There was the figure, of course, which we have walked through already, the endless private war against the next pound, and the looming shadow of the heavier self. The cigarette had been her ally in that war from the beginning, the thing to reach for instead of the sweet, the small discipline that kept the shadow at bay. But the campaigns did not stop at the figure. They reached for the nerves as well, and the nerves were, if anything, an even richer field, because a woman's life in those years offered so many reasons to be tired and strained and quietly worn down, and so few permitted outlets for any of it. So the cigarette was offered as a soother, a settler, a small island of calm in a harried day. Reach for one when the nerves are frayed, the advertisement suggested. Let it steady you, ease the tension, give you a moment that belongs to no one but yourself. For a woman whose hours were filled with the needs of others, whose own rest was always the first thing sacrificed, the promise of a private interval of calm was no small thing. The cigarette was sold not only as a guard for her body, but as a refuge for her spirit, a permitted pause, a tiny rebellion of self-care in a life arranged around the care of everyone else. And here, as everywhere in this story, there was a grain of something real that the campaign could stretch. The act of pausing, of stepping aside, of doing one small thing slowly and only for oneself, is genuinely soothing, with or without a cigarette. The ritual of lighting, the deep breath drawn in, the moment of stillness, these are calming acts in themselves. The cigarette borrowed the calm of the pause and claimed it as its own, the way it had borrowed the calm of the doctor's authority. The woman felt soothed, and she was, a little, by the pause, but she gave the credit to the cigarette, and the cigarette took it, and kept her reaching for the next one. Some campaigns ventured even into the territory of digestion, suggesting that a cigarette after a meal aided the body's work, settled the stomach, eased the heaviness of eating. For digestion's sake, one famous line ran, "Smoke this brand." The claim draped the cigarette in yet another layer of false healthfulness, presenting it not as an indulgence to be excused but as a positive aid to the body's natural functioning, a kind of medicine taken for pleasure. Whether anyone fully believed that the smoke was good for the stomach is doubtful, but the claim did its quieter work, which was simply to keep accumulating in the listener's mind the impression that the cigarette was on the body's side. Notice the pattern across all of these, the figure and the nerves and the digestion. Each claim took a real human need, the need to be slender, the need to be calm, the need to feel well after eating, and offered the cigarette as its servant. The cigarette became, in the world the campaigns built, a kind of universal helper, attentive to a woman's every discomfort, always ready with its small white answer. It guarded her shape, it steadied her nerves, it eased her digestion. It asked nothing and gave everything. No wonder she came to lean on it. It had been designed, claim by claim, to make itself indispensable. Some brands distilled this into a single tidy image, a small zone of the body where the cigarette's supposed virtues were said to gather, the taste and the throat, presented as the twin gauges by which a smoker should judge her cigarette. Test it there, the campaigns urged, in the taste and the throat, and you will find this brand kind to both. The image was clever because it narrowed the woman's attention to exactly the two places where a cigarette might plausibly seem benign, the mouth and the upper throat, and drew her eye firmly away from the place where the real harm was gathering, the deep and silent interior of the lungs, which no taste and no momentary throat comfort could report on at all. That misdirection was the quiet genius running under all the women's claims. By fixing her attention on the figure, the nerves, the taste, the throat, all the immediate and checkable surfaces, the campaign kept her eye away from the lungs, the slow and uncheckable depth where the cost was quietly mounting. Every promise pointed at something she could verify and approve. None pointed at the thing she could not see. She was invited to inspect the cigarette in all the places where it looked innocent and was never once directed toward the place where it was not. And she inspected and approved and reached for another, exactly as intended. It is worth holding in the dark a certain tenderness toward this woman and the trap that was built so precisely around her wishes. She wanted to be slim, calm, well, and acceptable, and these are not foolish things to want. They are among the most ordinary things a person can want. The campaign did not have to invent a single one of her desires. It only had to study them and answer each in turn with the same small white object, and trust that a need met, however falsely, would keep her coming back. She was not weak for being met. She was simply human, and the machine had been built with great care to fit the shape of an ordinary human longing. And all the while, beneath the figure and the nerves and the taste and the throat, the doctor stood behind every claim, lending it his borrowed weight. It was the white coat that let the woman believe the cigarette could be good for her digestion, good for her nerves, kind to her throat. Without the doctor's borrowed authority, these would have been mere boasts easily doubted. With it, they became something closer to medical guidance, the considered advice of the body's appointed guardian. The doctor did not make the specific promises, but he stood behind them all, an invented figure in a white coat, nodding at whatever the campaign needed him to nod at, and his nod turned boast into counsel. Let the woman go now, gently, with all her ordinary wishes and the small white answer that betrayed every one of them. She's at rest now, whoever she was, the particular woman in the particular kitchen on the particular evening, reaching for the cigarette that promised to keep her slim and calm and well. Her struggles are over. The promises that surrounded her have all expired. The figure she guarded, the nerves she soothed, the shape she feared becoming, all of it has been carried off into the quiet where such things finally cease to matter. You do not have to guard anything tonight. Not your figure, not your nerves, not your digestion, not your throat. You are not a target for any claim. You are simply a person at rest in a dark, warm room, owed calm and giving it to yourself for free, with no cigarette and no white coat and no promise required. Let that be the truest pause of all, the one the campaigns only imitated, the real and unsold stillness of a body finally permitted to do nothing. Sink into it. It costs nothing, and it has never once harmed anyone, and it is yours. The story has a few rooms left, and they grow quieter as they go, for we are coming now to the part where the truth began, slowly to break through, where the science that had been gathering in the shadows finally raised its voice, where the long, comfortable lie began at last to come apart. It is a gentler stretch of the story than what came before in a way, because it is the part where the harm begins, slowly, to be named. But there is no need to reach it tonight. Rest here in the real stillness a while longer. The breaking of the lie can wait for you. It waited for the world long enough. All the while the campaigns ran, all the while the white coats nodded and the women reached and the precise numbers climbed across the billboards, something else was happening slowly, in places far from the advertising rooms, in laboratories and clinics, and the quiet offices of researchers who had begun to notice a pattern. A different kind of knowledge was gathering. It gathered without slogans, without budgets, without the bright machinery of persuasion. It gathered the way real knowledge usually does, in small, careful increments, in observations that did not at first seem to mean very much, until one day they did. The pattern that the researchers began to notice was a grim one, and it concerned a disease that had once been rare and was becoming with alarming speed far less rare. Cancer of the lung, a condition so uncommon in earlier generations that some older doctors had scarcely seen a case, was rising, year by year, in a steep and frightening line. Something had changed in the bodies of the population, and the change was killing people, and the careful observers who first saw the line climbing began to ask the obvious and terrible question: what new thing had entered ordinary life that might account for it? What had millions of people taken up in the space of a few decades that they had not done before? The answer, of course, was sitting in nearly every hand. The cigarette, which had spread from a minority habit to a near universal one across the same span of years in which the lung cancer line was climbing, was the most obvious candidate, and some researchers, as early as the 1930s, began to say so cautiously, in the careful hedged language of people who know how much weight their words might one day have to bear. They noticed that the people dying of the new lung cancer were overwhelmingly smokers. They noticed that the rise of the disease tracked the rise of the habit. They began quietly to suspect. Some of this early work was done in places that history would later remember for darker reasons, and some of it was done in the ordinary clinics of ordinary countries by ordinary doctors troubled by what they were seeing. But everywhere it appeared, it ran up against a wall, and the wall was not made of contrary evidence. The wall was made of disbelief, of reluctance, of the sheer difficulty of accepting that a thing so common, so accepted, so woven into the daily life of nearly everyone, including the doctors themselves, could be a slow and patient killer. The evidence whispered. The world did not want to hear. It is worth understanding why the whisper was so easy to ignore, because the reasons are human and not stupid. The harm of the cigarette was slow, unfolding across decades, so that the smoker of 20 saw no consequence, and the dying patient of 60 could not easily trace his disease back 40 years to a habit begun in youth. The harm was also statistical, visible clearly only in large numbers, in the climbing line across a whole population, not in any single case where the cause might be plainly read. And the harm was unwelcome, profoundly unwelcome, to a society that loved its cigarettes and had built an entire culture and economy around them. Slow, statistical, unwelcome. 3 good reasons for a true thing to go unheard. Against the whisper of the science stood the roar of the campaigns, and it was no contest for a long time. On one side, a handful of careful researchers speaking in hedged and cautious tones about a statistical association that would take years to prove. On the other, the vast bright apparatus of persuasion, the billboards and the magazines and the white coats and the precise numbers, all singing the same reassuring song, all funded by some of the deepest pockets in the country. The smoker who felt a flicker of worry had only to open a magazine to have it soothed. The science could not afford to soothe anyone. It could only slowly accumulate. And the doctors, caught in the middle of this, were in a strange and difficult position that deserves our sympathy even as it deserves our clear sight. They were, many of them, smokers themselves, reassured by their own journals and their own habits, and the general comfort of their society. They were trained to demand high standards of proof before condemning anything, which is usually a virtue, but which, in this case, became a kind of trap, because the proof for a slow statistical harm is necessarily slow to assemble, and while it assembled, the habit went on killing. The very rigour of the profession, its admirable refusal to leap to conclusions, helped delay the conclusion that needed to be reached. There is a lesson here that is larger than cigarettes, and you may hold it lightly as the dark gathers. A harm that is slow, statistical and unwelcome is the hardest kind for a society to face, because every feature of it works against recognition. It does not announce itself in any single case, it hides in the aggregate, and it asks people to give up something they love on the strength of evidence that is, by its nature, never quite as immediate as the pleasure it would take away. Such harms can run for decades, fully present in the data, fully invisible to the eye, until the line climbs so high and so undeniably that even the most reluctant world can no longer look away. That moment was coming. The whisper was growing, year by year, study by study, as more researchers noticed the same climbing line and asked the same terrible question and arrived, independently, at the same suspect. By the late 1940s, the whisper was nearly a voice, and the careful researchers were preparing the work that would, at the turn of the decade, turn suspicion into something much harder to dismiss. Two studies in particular, published in 1950, would mark a kind of threshold, after which the comfortable lie could still be told but could no longer be told innocently. We will come to them. They are the hinge on which the whole long story finally begins to turn. But tonight, in the quiet, simply rest in the strange interval before the turning, the years when the truth was present but unspoken, gathering in the laboratories while the billboards roared on above it. There is something almost peaceful about that interval, seen from a safe distance, the way there is something peaceful about the deep stillness before a season changes, when the old weather still holds but the new is already on its way, felt but not yet arrived. The truth was coming. It was already real. It simply had not yet been allowed to speak. There is a particular sorrow in the timing of it all when you set the pieces side by side. The studies that would name the harm were already being done while the brightest campaigns were still running. The careful researchers already gathering their figures while the advertisements still sang of throat protection and the doctor's nod. The truth and the lie ran alongside each other for years, in the same world, in the same decades, the one loud and bright and everywhere, the other quiet and slow and confined to the journals few outside the profession ever read. The lie had every advantage of volume and colour and reach. The truth had only the one advantage that finally mattered, which was that it was true. And truth, in the end, has a strange patience that no campaign can match. For a campaign must be paid for, sustained, refreshed, kept always running at great cost, while the truth simply waits, needing nothing, indifferent to whether anyone is listening, accumulating quietly until the day it cannot be ignored. The companies had to spend fortunes year upon year to keep their version aloft. The researchers had only to keep counting, keep comparing, keep letting the figures climb. One side was pushing a weight uphill forever. The other side had gravity itself, the slow gravity of the real, working steadily on its behalf. It was never, in the long run, a fair fight, and the cigarette companies, for all their genius, were on the losing side of it from the start. Let the whisper whisper on far below in the quiet laboratories of the past. It does not need your attention to do its slow, patient work. It gathered its evidence with or without anyone listening, the way the truth always does, indifferent to whether it is believed, content to wait until the world is ready. You can let it gather without you tonight. You can lie here in the warm dark, far above the climbing line and the careful studies, and let the whole slow turning happen in its own time, which is the only time it could ever happen in. The roar of the campaigns is fading now, fading as it had to fade, as every roar eventually does when the slow patient whisper underneath it finally grows loud enough to be heard. We are near the turning, but you do not have to be awake for it. The story will turn whether you witness it or not gently in the dark, and the part of it that breaks the long lie will be waiting, soft and certain, whenever you return. Rest. The truth is coming, and it is on your side, and it has all the time in the world. The studies of 1950. In the year 1950, the whisper became a voice that could no longer be politely ignored, and it spoke through the dry, careful language of science, which is the language that, in the end, the modern world is most obliged to believe. That year saw the publication of studies on both sides of the ocean that examined the question with a rigour the earlier work had lacked, gathering large numbers of patients, comparing those who had the lung cancer with those who did not, and asking with statistical care what separated the two groups. The answer that came back was stark and consistent and very hard to argue away. The thing that most reliably separated the sick from the well was the cigarette. The researchers who did this work were careful people, and they framed their findings carefully in the hedged conditional language of their trade. They did not stand on chairs and shout. They presented their data, their methods, their comparisons, and they drew the conclusion that the data supported, which was that smoking was strongly associated with the cancer, that the heavier the smoking, the greater the risk, that the relationship was too consistent and too steep to be easily explained by chance or by some hidden third factor. It was not yet, in the strictest sense, proof of cause, but it was the kind of evidence that, in any other matter, would have moved a reasonable person to alarm. One of the researchers involved in this work, a man who had himself been a smoker, is said to have given up the habit partway through the study, as the findings emerged from his own data, persuaded by the very evidence he was assembling. There is something quietly moving in that image, the scientist convinced by his own results, setting down his cigarette not because a campaign told him to, but because the truth he was uncovering left him no honest choice. It is the opposite, in every way, of the doctor in the advertisement reaching for his camel between patients. One man was handed a free cigarette and a leading question. The other followed his own data to the only conclusion it allowed, and changed his life accordingly. The studies of 1950 did not end the matter. The truth never arrives all at once, and powerful interests do not surrender to a single year's findings. But they marked a threshold, a line across the history, after which the situation was different in a way that could not be undone. Before, a person might tell the comfortable lie in good conscience, genuinely uncertain, genuinely able to believe the reassuring song. After, the lie could still be told, and would be told, loudly, for years to come, but it could no longer be told innocently. The evidence was now on the table, public, replicated, available to anyone who cared to look. To go on reassuring the public after that was to choose to do so, against the evidence, for reasons that had nothing to do with the truth. And the cigarette companies did choose to go on. This is the part of the story where the gentle reading grows harder to sustain, where the human reluctance and the slow proof and the understandable hesitation give way to something colder and more deliberate. Faced with the studies, faced with the climbing line and the careful comparisons and the growing chorus of researchers, the companies did not pause the campaigns, did not soften the claims, did not quietly retire the white coat. They doubled down. They reached for the tools of persuasion they knew so well, and they turned those tools now, not towards selling the cigarette's benefits, but towards something darker, the manufacture of doubt about the science itself. That campaign of doubt deserves its own chapter, and we will give it one, for it is in some ways the most cynical passage in the whole long history. But pause here, at the threshold, and feel the weight of the moment. For decades the harm had been hidden, slow and statistical and unwelcome, easy to miss in good faith. Now it had been found. Now it had been named, in the careful public language of science, by researchers with no product to sell. The fog had lifted just enough, and on the far side of it stood a plain and terrible fact. The thing that millions had been told would keep them slim and calm and well was, the evidence now strongly suggested, killing a great many of them. What should a profession have done at that threshold? What should the doctors, whose borrowed authority had helped sell the very habit now under indictment, have done with the news? The honest answer is that they should have turned sharply and publicly, and many of the best of them began to. But institutions turned slowly, and the cigarette was still woven into the daily life of doctors as much as anyone, and the companies were already deploying their fog machines to keep the matter seeming unsettled. The turning, when it came, would be real, but it would be gradual, lagging years behind the evidence, costing in that lag a toll that cannot be counted. It is worth saying, gently, that the researchers who did this work performed a kind of quiet heroism, the unglamorous heroism of people who follow the evidence to an unwelcome place and report what they find. Knowing it will make them no friends among the powerful, they were not loud. They did not become famous, most of them, the way the advertising men and the company presidents were famous. But they did the thing that, in the end, mattered most. They looked at the climbing line, asked the hard question, gathered the careful data, and told the truth in their dry conditional language against the roar of an industry that very much wished them silent. Lie with that for a moment, the image of the careful researcher at his desk, the data spread before him, the unwelcome pattern emerging, the cigarette set down for good as the truth came clear. It is a small and undramatic image, but it is the hinge of the whole story, the point where the long lie began at last to lose. Everything before it was the building of the deception. Everything after it is the slow, contested, never quite complete unwinding. And the unwinding began here, quietly in 1950, with a few careful people who simply refused to look away. There is comfort in that, real comfort, the kind you can carry down into sleep. The lie was enormous and brilliant and backed by some of the deepest resources in the country, and it lost. Slowly, against resistance, at a terrible cost, but it lost, because the truth had been gathering all along in the quiet laboratories, patient and indifferent to the roar, and once it was spoken it could not be unspoken. The fog machines would run for years yet, but the fog was fog, and the fact underneath it was solid, and in the long run the solid thing always outlasts the fog. Let the careful researcher have his quiet victory. In the dim room of your mind, the cigarette set down, the truth told, the threshold crossed. He cannot know at his desk in 1950 how long the unwinding will take or how much it will cost. He knows only that he has found something true and reported it honestly, and that is the whole of what he can do, and it is enough. It was in the end exactly enough, though it would take years for the world to admit it. Rest now at the threshold, with the truth newly spoken and the long unwinding just begun. The hardest part of the story is behind us, the building of the lie, and what remains is its slow defeat, contested and partial and real. You do not have to follow that defeat tonight step by step, through the fog machines and the filters and the great reckoning still to come. You can let it unfold in the dark without you, knowing how it ends, knowing the truth wins, slowly, the way it always does. Sink into the warmth, the fact is solid, the fog will lift, and you are safe, far away, in a world the careful researchers helped to make. When the studies came and the evidence could no longer be hidden, the cigarette companies faced a choice, and the choice they made is the coldest decision in the whole long story. They could have accepted the findings, warned their customers, changed their business. Instead, they reached one more time for the men who understood persuasion, and they pointed that persuasion at a new and stranger target. Not at selling the cigarette's virtues, which were growing harder to claim, but at unsettling the science that threatened it, at keeping the public uncertain, at manufacturing doubt where the evidence was pointing toward a conclusion the companies could not afford. In the middle of the 1950s, the major companies came together and issued a public statement, addressed to the smokers of the nation, that has become a kind of infamous landmark. It acknowledged that research had raised questions. It professed deep concern for the public's health, the very health its product was harming, and it promised that the industry would support research into the matter, would help discover the truth, would act as a responsible partner in the search for answers. It was framed as candor, as openness, as the honest response of an industry that cared. It was, in fact, the opening move in a long campaign to ensure that the answers, however clear they became, would always seem still in doubt. The genius of the doubt strategy, and it was a genius of a genuinely dark kind, was that it did not need to prove the science wrong. It needed only to make the science seem unsettled, to keep alive in the public mind the impression that the experts disagreed, that the matter was still open, that no one really knew for certain. A person who believes a thing is proven will act on it. A person who believes the experts are still arguing will wait, will hesitate, will go on with the comfortable habit a while longer, telling herself that the case is not yet closed. The companies did not need to win the argument. They needed only to keep the argument seeming to go on, and a seeming argument, unlike a real one, can be sustained indefinitely with enough money. So they funded research, as promised, but research of a particular kind, designed less to find the truth than to complicate it, to raise questions, to suggest other possible causes, to emphasize every uncertainty and downplay every finding. They supported scientists willing to stress the doubts. They publicized any study that muddied the picture and ignored the mounting pile that clarified it. They learned to speak the language of scientific caution, of more research being needed, of the matter not yet being settled, and to use that language, which in honest hands is a virtue, as a weapon to delay the very conclusion that honest caution should have reached years before. It is a strange and chilling thing to watch. In the dim light, the tools of science turned against science, the language of careful inquiry used to prevent inquiry from ever concluding. The companies understood that the public, for the most part, could not weigh the studies for itself, could not judge which research was sound and which was muddying, and so the public would rely on the general impression of where the experts stood. And the general impression could be managed, fogged, kept perpetually uncertain by an industry with the resources to fund a permanent counter-chorus. The smoker, hearing that the matter was still debated, was given exactly what she wanted, which was permission to wait, and waiting was all the companies needed her to do. And here, once more, the doctor's borrowed authority did its quiet work, though in a new key. Where once the white coat had vouched for the cigarette's benefits, now the appearance of medical and scientific disagreement was used to vouch for the cigarette's continued innocence. If some scientists, some doctors, still questioned the link, then surely a person could go on smoking in good conscience until the questions were resolved. The companies cultivated and amplified those questioning voices, however few, however funded, precisely because the public could not tell a genuine scientific minority from a manufactured one, and because the mere existence of disagreement was enough to keep the comfortable habit going. This strategy, you may sense, was not really about cigarettes at all in the end. It was a discovery, a dark technique, that the companies and their persuaders worked out in those years, and that the world has had to reckon with ever since. They discovered that you do not need to disprove an unwelcome truth. You need only to manufacture the appearance of doubt about it, to keep it seeming unsettled, and the human wish to avoid an unwelcome conclusion will do the rest. People will cling to a manufactured uncertainty, because the uncertainty lets them keep what they want. The technique would outlive the cigarette campaigns, would be borrowed by other industries facing other inconvenient truths, would become one of the more poisonous inheritances of the whole sorry episode. For the women at the centre of our story, the doubt campaign meant that the lie they had been told could go on a while longer, dressed now not as confident promise, but as open question. The cigarette might no longer be claimed, quite so boldly, to keep them slim and well, but it could be defended as not yet proven harmful, the science still unsettled, the experts still arguing. And so the habit, woven so deeply into the daily defence of the figure and the soothing of the nerves, did not have to be given up. Not yet. Not until the matter was certain, and the companies laboured to ensure that certainty stayed always just over the horizon. It would not work forever. The evidence kept climbing, study after study, year after year, until even the most artful fog could not obscure it, until the great public health bodies would finally speak with a clarity no manufactured doubt could withstand. But the doubt campaign bought the companies years, perhaps decades, and in those years the habit went on, and the harm went on, and the women and men who might have set down the cigarette a little sooner, had the truth been allowed to stand clear, went on reaching for it instead, soothed by an uncertainty that had been built for them on purpose. Let the fog machines run on far away, in the past where they belong. They ran for a long time and they did real harm, and they are still in their way running somewhere, pointed now at other truths. But the fog they made was only ever fog, and you do not have to breathe it tonight. You can see clearly here in the dark exactly what the doubt was and how it was made and why. And seeing it clearly is its own kind of safety, the safety of a person who knows the trick and so can never quite be caught by it again. Set the doubt down then, gently, the way you have set down everything else. The companies are gone. The fog they made has long since thinned. The truth they tried to obscure stands plain now, settled, beyond serious question, a thing every schoolchild learns. The whole vast machinery of manufactured uncertainty wound down, in the end, defeated by the patient accumulation it could delay but never stop. You can rest in the clarity it failed to prevent. We are nearing the end of the long building now, the last few rooms, where the doctors at last turned, where the journals closed their pages to the cigarette, where the great public reckoning finally came. They are gentler rooms, these last ones, full of the relief of a long lie ending, but there is no need to walk through even them tonight if sleep is near. The story will hold. The turning happened, the truth won, and you can drift toward it, or past it, into the deeper dark, knowing that the ending is a good one, slow and costly and partial, but good. The way the truth coming out is always in the end good. As the doubt machines hummed and the evidence kept climbing, a new shape began to appear at the end of the cigarette, small and white and faintly reassuring, and it carried with it a promise that was, in its own quiet way, the most cunning of them all. The filter had arrived. And the filter, the companies understood, was not really a piece of engineering so much as a piece of comfort, a soft white answer to a fear that had begun, at last, to stir in the back of the smoker's mind. People were growing uneasy. The whisper of doubt had reached them despite every effort to fog it. And here, conveniently, was a small thing on the end of the cigarette that seemed to say, without quite saying it, that someone had heard the worry and done something about it. Filters were not new, not entirely. They had existed for years, sold mostly to women in the early days as a genteel nicety, a way to keep the tobacco flecks off the lips, a touch of refinement rather than protection. But in the 1950s, as the cancer studies mounted and the public grew nervous, the filter was quietly reborn. It stopped being a nicety and became a reassurance. It stopped being about elegance and started being about safety, or rather about the feeling of safety, which the companies had learned long ago was a far more sellable thing than safety itself. The filtered cigarette was marketed to the anxious smoker as the sensible choice, the modern choice, the choice of a person who took the new concerns seriously and had found a reasonable way to keep her habit while answering them. Consider how perfectly this served the company's need. The studies were frightening people. A frightened person might quit. But a frightened person offered a small white solution, told that the danger had been caught and filtered away, might not quit at all. She might simply switch from her old unfiltered brand to a new filtered one, and go on smoking with her conscience eased and her fear soothed. And the company would lose nothing, would in fact often gain, for the filtered brands were new and could be sold with all the excitement of a fresh promise. The filter did not need to make the cigarette safe. It needed only to make the smoker feel that the problem had been handled, so that she would keep reaching for the pack instead of setting it down. And feel handled she did. The advertisements for the new filtered brands spoke the language of science and protection, of guarding the throat, of trapping the harsh elements, of giving the smoker the pleasure without so much of the worry. They showed clean white laboratories and clean white filters and clean white promises, and they let the anxious customer believe that the men in the laboratories had found the problem and solved it, when in truth the men in the laboratories, the honest ones, were finding something quite different, something the filter did nothing meaningful to prevent. The filter caught some particles. It changed the taste. It looked like a precaution. What it did not do, in any degree that mattered, was make the cigarette safe to smoke. There is a particular cruelty in this that is worth pausing over, gently, in the quiet. A person genuinely worried about her health, a person doing what she believed was the responsible thing, choosing the safer-seeming option, taking the precaution, was being sold the appearance of safety in place of the substance of it. Her very caution was being turned into a reason to keep going. The instinct that might have saved her, the unease, the wish to protect herself, was caught and redirected, like a stream diverted from its course, into the purchase of a filtered brand that protected the company far more than it protected her. The better part of her, the careful part, the part that wanted to do right by her own body, was the part the filter was designed to capture. Some of the filtered brands of those years went further still, making claims that crossed from the merely misleading into the nearly fantastical, promising to remove this or that harmful element, to deliver a smoke purified and refined, scientifically improved, safer by some measurable degree. A few of these claims were so bold that even in that loosely governed age they drew scrutiny, were challenged, were eventually reined in. But the reining in came slowly, long after the promises had done their work, long after millions of anxious smokers had been gently talked out of their fear and into a new brand. The correction, as corrections in this story always do, arrived too late to help the people the claim had already soothed. Did the filter help at all, you might wonder, drifting there, half listening? It is a fair question, and the honest answer is the saddest kind. In the narrow technical sense, certain filters did trap certain things, did alter what reached the smoker in small ways that could be measured in a laboratory. But the cigarette remained, at its heart, what it had always been, a delivery system for smoke, and for the substance in the smoke that did the harm. And no white tip on the end could change that essential fact. The filter was real enough to point to and far too small to matter. It was, like so much in this story, a true thing arranged to support a false impression, a fragment of genuine engineering pressed into the service of a comforting lie. The companies, of course, knew this better than anyone. for they were the ones doing the measuring. Inside their own laboratories, away from the bright advertisements, their researchers were learning a great deal about what was actually in the smoke and what it actually did, and very little of what they learned would have reassured the customer holding the filtered cigarette and feeling safe. But that knowledge stayed inside the building. What went out to the public was the white tip and the clean laboratory and the gentle suggestion that someone had taken care of the problem. The gap between what the companies knew and what they said had been a feature of this story from the beginning, and with the filter, it widened into a chasm. For the women in particular, the filter carried an extra layer of meaning, for it was clean and white and delicate, and it fit the whole long aesthetic the cigarette had been wrapped in since the days of the torches of freedom. A filtered cigarette looked tidy in a gloved hand. It suited the image of the modern, careful, self-possessed woman that the advertisements had spent decades constructing, and so the filter was not only a reassurance about health, but a refinement of style, a way of smoking that felt both safer and more elegant at once. And the two feelings reinforced each other, the cleanliness of the look bleeding into a sense of the cleanliness of the act, until the filtered cigarette seemed almost wholesome, almost a thing a careful woman did to take care of herself. It is worth seeing how many threads of the long deception came together in that small white tip. The grain of truth, here the genuine fact that a filter traps some particles, stretched into a promise it could not keep. The borrowed authority of science, the laboratories and the men in white, the redirection of the smoker's own better instincts into the service of the habit, the true statement arranged to leave a false impression, the harm known inside the building and hidden from the people outside it. Everything the companies had learned across the decades was folded into the filter, refined and concentrated, the whole art of the thing distilled into an object small enough to balance on a fingertip. And the smokers, for the most part, believed. They switched brands. They felt better. They told themselves they had done the sensible thing, had answered the new worry in a reasonable way, and they went on, year after year, drawing the smoke through the small white tip that did so little and promised so much. The fear that might have freed them had been caught and held gently in the filter, and there it stayed, a worry soothed rather than answered, while the years passed and the harm went quietly on beneath the comforting white surface. Let the filter rest there, then, on the edge of your awareness, small and white and far away. It was a clever thing, and a sad one, and it belonged to a time when comfort was sold in place of truth more easily than it can be now. The promises it carried have long since been seen through. The brands that made the boldest claims were corrected eventually, and the whole notion that a small white tip could make the cigarette safe has dissolved into the general understanding of how the trick was worked. You do not have to believe the filter tonight. You can see exactly what it was, a comfort with nothing behind it, and let it go. The story turns gentler from here, slowly, the way a long night turns gradually toward morning without your quite noticing the moment it begins. For even as the filter was soothing the anxious smoker, the doctors were beginning to stir, the journals were beginning to reconsider, and the long alliance between the white coat and the cigarette was beginning, at last, to crack. We're coming to the turning now, the part of the story where the borrowed authority is quietly given back. But there is no hurry to reach it. The filter spins slowly to a stop. The room goes quiet, and you can rest here a while, in the lull before the turning, with nothing required of you but to breathe. Somewhere in the middle of the 1950s, in offices and editorial rooms and the quiet councils of the medical profession, a change began that this whole long story had been waiting for, though it came, as such changes do, slowly and unevenly, and later than it should have. The doctors began to take back the authority they had lent. The white coat which had stood in the advertisements for so many years vouching for the cigarette began, at last, to step out of the frame. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen cleanly, and there were many within the profession who had never lent their names in the first place, and who had been uneasy for years. But the tide had turned, and the men who healed began the slow work of withdrawing from the men who sold. The most visible moment of this turning came from the journals, those grave and respectable pages that had carried cigarette advertisements for decades, lending the smoke the quiet endorsement of their authority. For years, the great medical journal of the American profession had run those advertisements, had taken the tobacco money, had let the cigarette sit among its columns of research as though it belonged there. And then, in the early 1950s, the journal stopped. It announced that it would no longer accept advertising for cigarettes. The decision was framed in measured professional language, but its meaning was unmistakable. The most authoritative voice in American medicine had decided that it could no longer, in good conscience, let its pages be used to sell the thing the evidence was beginning to condemn. Picture the weight of that decision, made not in a courtroom or a laboratory, but in the offices where a journal decides what it will and will not print. There was money in those advertisements, real money, the kind a publication relies on. To turn it away was to choose principle over revenue, in an age when the principle was not yet certain enough to be safe, and the revenue was certain indeed. The men who made the choice could not have known, with the clarity we have now, exactly how right they were. They knew only that the evidence was mounting, that the claims in the advertisements had grown impossible to square with the research in the articles, and that a medical journal selling cigarettes had become a contradiction it could no longer carry, and so they let the money go. It is a small heroism, perhaps, in the scheme of things, a journal declining an advertisement. But it mattered, because of what the journal was and what it represented. For decades the cigarette had borrowed the authority of medicine, had dressed itself in the white coat, had leaned on the trust people placed in their doctors, and now the institution at the centre of that trust had said, clearly and publicly, that it would lend the cigarette its authority no longer. The borrowing was being called in, the white coat was being taken back, and once the great journal had acted, others found it easier to follow, for the hardest thing in any turning is to be the first to move, and the first had moved. Around the same time, the most famous medical advertisement of them all began quietly to fade. The campaign built on the claim that more doctors smoked one brand than any other, the campaign that had stood for years on the rigged convention surveys and the free cartons and the leading questions, came at last to its end. The companies did not announce its retirement with any fanfare, of course. Campaigns of that kind do not die loudly. They simply appear less, and then not at all, withdrawn as quietly as they can be managed, because to end such a campaign with any noise would be to admit what its ending meant, but it ended. The doctor in the advertisement, who had recommended the cigarette for so long, stopped recommending it, and slipped away, and did not come back. Why did it end, you might ask, drifting there in the warm dark? It ended because it had become untenable, because the gap between the doctor in the advertisement and the doctor in the examining room had grown too wide to sustain. Real doctors, more and more of them, were reading the studies, were seeing the patients, were drawing the conclusions, and a profession that was beginning privately to fear the cigarette could not go on publicly endorsing it, without the whole arrangement collapsing into obvious absurdity. The campaign had always depended on the borrowed dignity of medicine, and medicine was withdrawing its dignity, and without it the campaign had nothing left to stand on but the bare commercial wish to sell, which had never been enough on its own. The professional bodies, the great associations and societies that spoke for the doctors as a group, moved more slowly still, as such bodies always do, weighed down by caution and committee and the wish to be certain before they spoke. For years they had been quiet, too quiet, neither endorsing the cigarette nor clearly condemning it, leaving the field to the advertisers. But through the 1950s their silence began to break. Statements were made, concerns were voiced, studies were acknowledged. The voice of organised medicine, which had been so absent when it might have done the most good, began at last to be heard on the side of the truth, gathering strength as the evidence gathered, building toward the great public declaration that would come in the following decade. There is a temptation, looking back, to be hard on the profession for moving so slowly, for lending its authority so long, for waking so late to a harm that some within it had seen clearly for years. And there is justice in that judgment. But there is something else worth holding alongside it gently, which is the difficulty of the thing at the time. The evidence had to accumulate. The doubt machines were working hard to keep it seeming unsettled. A careful profession, trained to wait for certainty, was exactly the kind of institution the doubt campaign was designed to paralyse. That medicine turned at all, that it took back its authority even as slowly as it did, was a victory of a kind. The slow victory of evidence over comfort, which is the only kind of victory this story ever offers. And for the women at the centre of it all, the withdrawal of the white coat meant that the deepest source of the lie was drying up. The whole campaign aimed at them had rested finally on the borrowed trust of the doctor, the sense that a figure of healing had vouched for the habit. The figure of healing was vouching no longer. The advertisements would go on for years yet, would find new angles, would lean on the filter and the doubt and the image of freedom. But the particular trick of the doctor's endorsement, the trick that had given the cigarette its medical disguise, was finished, taken apart from the inside by the very profession whose authority had made it possible. You can feel, perhaps, a kind of loosening in the story here, a knot beginning to come undone. For chapters now we have watched the alliance form and tighten, the doctor drawn into the advertisement, the journal carrying the smoke among its columns, the trust of medicine bent to the service of the sale, and now, slowly, that alliance is coming apart, the doctor stepping back, the journal closing its pages, the profession finding its voice. The thing that took decades to build is beginning to be dismantled, and there is relief in watching it. The quiet relief of a wrong being slowly set right. It is the relief, perhaps, that you can rest in tonight. Not the sharp satisfaction of a sudden victory, for this story has none of those, but the slower, gentler relief of a long correction underway, of authority returning to its proper place, of the men who heal remembering that their first duty was never to the men who sell. The white coat is going back where it belongs, into the examining room, onto the shoulders of people whose business is care and not persuasion. And the cigarette is being left, slowly, to stand on its own, stripped of the borrowed dignity it had worn for so long. Rest there, in the loosening. The great public reckoning is still ahead, the moment when the highest medical authority in the land would speak with a clarity that no advertisement and no doubt campaign could withstand. We are coming to it. But the ground for it was laid here, in these quieter turnings, the journal's decision, the campaign's fading, the profession finding its voice. The big moment, when it comes, will only be the gathering of all these smaller ones into a single declaration. And you can drift toward it gently, knowing the turning has already begun, the knot already loosening, the long lie already, quietly, starting to come undone. On a winter Saturday in the middle of the 1960s, in a room in Washington, a group of men sat before the assembled press and delivered the document that this whole long story had been moving toward, the report that would, at last, gather all the scattered evidence into a single authoritative voice and say plainly what the advertisements had spent decades obscuring. The report was released on a Saturday on purpose, chosen so that the news would have the weekend to settle before the stock markets opened, so that the shock to the great tobacco companies would land softly enough not to cause a panic. Even in the moment of telling the truth, the machinery of caution was turning, but the truth was told. The report had been a long time coming, and it had been built with extraordinary care, precisely because everyone involved understood how fiercely it would be attacked. A committee of scientists had been assembled, chosen for their independence, screened to ensure that none had taken a public position on the question, some of them smokers themselves, so that no one could later claim the conclusion had been decided before the evidence was weighed. They had gone through the mountain of studies, the thousands of papers, the accumulated work of decades, slowly and rigorously behind closed doors, building a case that would be unassailable. They knew the doubt machines were waiting. They built something the doubt machines could not move. And when they had finished, the conclusion they reached was as plain as the long evasions had been intricate. Cigarette smoking, the report said, was a cause of serious disease, a cause of the cancer that had been rising for decades, a hazard grave enough to warrant action. It said this in the measured, careful language of science, hedged with all the proper qualifications, but the meaning beneath the careful language was unmistakable and final. The thing the companies had spent fortunes to keep seeming uncertain was, the highest medical authority in the nation now declared, no longer uncertain at all. The smoke was killing people. The question was settled. The long fog had at last been cut through. Imagine the weight of that Saturday, the gathered reporters, the careful men at the front of the room, the document in their hands that would change how a nation understood the small white object in tens of millions of pockets and purses. For decades the cigarette had been wrapped in glamour and freedom and medical reassurance, defended by doubt, softened by the filter, woven into the daily life of the country until it seemed as ordinary as coffee. And now, in a single careful document, the government's own highest health authority had named it for what it was. The advertisements could go on. The doubt could be funded a while longer. But after that Saturday, everyone who wished to know the truth could know it plainly from a source beyond serious challenge. What did it feel like, you might wonder, to be one of the millions of women who had believed, who had reached for the cigarette to stay slim, to steady the nerves, to do the modern and emancipated thing, and who now opened the newspaper to read that the habit so carefully sold to her was a cause of deadly disease? There must have been fear in it, and anger, and the particular vertigo of discovering that something woven deep into your daily life had been, all along, harming you while promising the opposite. Some quit. Many could not, for the habit had its hooks deep by then, deeper than any report could reach. But all of them now knew, and the knowing was itself a kind of ending, the end of the long innocence the advertisements had so carefully maintained. The report did not stop the companies, of course. They had known it was coming and had prepared. They issued their measured responses, their reminders that questions remained, their funded voices of continued doubt. The doubt machines ran on, but something fundamental had shifted beneath them, for the highest authority had spoken, and no amount of funded uncertainty could quite unspeak it. The burden had reversed. Before the report, the truth had to fight to be heard, against the comfortable assumption that the cigarette was harmless or nearly so. After the report, the comfortable assumption had to fight against the truth, and it was a losing fight, slow but certain, from that Saturday forward. And the government, having spoken, began at last to act, though here too the action came slowly and was fought at every step. In the years after the report, requirements arrived that had been unthinkable in the heyday of the doctor advertisements. A warning would be placed on the package itself, a small printed acknowledgement of the danger, riding along on the very object that carried the harm. The advertisements would be pushed back, restricted, eventually driven from the airwaves where they had sung their promises for so long. None of it came easily, all of it was resisted. But the direction had been set on that winter Saturday, and the direction did not reverse. There is a quiet justice in the image of the warning on the package when you hold it up against everything that came before. For decades the cigarette had carried messages, but they had been messages of reassurance, the doctor's recommendation, the throat protection. The figure kept slim, the nerves kept calm. Now it would carry a message of a different kind, a warning printed by law, a small admission of the truth riding on the very thing that had spent so long denying it. The object that had been wrapped in so many comforting lies would now be required to tell, in a few plain words, the truth about itself. It was not enough. It was very late. But it was something, and it had been a long time coming. For the long arc of our story, the report was the moment the borrowed authority of medicine completed its return. The cigarette had risen to power on the trust people placed in their doctors, on the white coat and the journal and the physician's recommendation. And now medicine, gathered into its highest official voice, had turned that trust fully against the cigarette, had used the same authority that once sold the smoke to condemn it. The thing that had been built with the doctor's borrowed dignity was being taken down with the doctor's reclaimed dignity. The wheel had come full circle, slowly across decades, and the authority had found its way home. It would be pleasant to say that the report ended the story, that the truth once spoken simply won, that the women stopped reaching for the cigarette and the companies folded and the harm ceased. But this story does not end that cleanly, and you are old enough, wise enough, drifting there in the dark to know that the truth being spoken is only ever the beginning of its long, slow, partial victory. The cigarette went on. The habit went on. The companies found new angles, new markets, new ways to sell. The report was a turning, the great turning, but a turning is not an ending, and the road after it was long. Still, let yourself rest in the turning tonight, for it is the closest thing to triumph this story contains. There was a Saturday in winter when the careful men sat down before the press and said the plain true thing at last, and after that Saturday the world could not go back to not knowing. The fog had been cut, the authority had come home, the warning would ride on the package from then on. It was late, and it was partial, and it did not save everyone, and still it was the moment the long deception met an authority it could not corrupt or fog or buy, and lost. Breathe into that gently as the chapter closes. The truth was spoken plainly from the highest place, and it held. Whatever came after, that much was done and could not be undone. And there are only a few rooms left now in our long building, the rooms where we follow the threads to where they finally lead, the women who believed, the strange afterlife of the freedom the cigarette had promised, the things that remained when all the rest had faded. Gentle rooms, these last ones. You may walk through them, or you may stay here, resting in the turning, and let sleep take you whenever it comes. The truth is told, the hardest part is behind us, you can let go. A few years after the report, when the warning had begun to ride on the package and the truth had been spoken from the highest place, the companies did a thing so audacious, so perfectly in keeping with everything that had come before, that it deserves to be looked at slowly in the quiet as the final turn of the long screw. They launched a cigarette made just for women, wrapped in the language of liberation, sold beneath a slogan that praised how far women had travelled, how much freedom they had won. It was the torches of freedom returned, 4 decades on, refined and brightened and aimed once more at exactly the place it had always been aimed, at a woman's wish to be modern, independent, and free. The new brand was long and slender, designed to suggest the slim figure it had always been the cigarette's promise to protect, and it was marketed with images of women who had thrown off the old constraints, who worked and chose and lived as they pleased, and who expressed all this liberation by holding a cigarette. The slogan congratulated women on the distance they had come, the rights they had won, the old limitations they had left behind, and it tied all that genuine progress, all that hard-won freedom, to the act of smoking a particular brand, exactly as Bernays had tied it to the torches in the parade so many years before. The trick was old. The trick had always worked. The company saw no reason to retire it now. Consider the breathtaking nerve of it, drifting there in the dark. By this point the truth was known. The report had been issued. The warning was on the package. The doctors had withdrawn. The journals had closed their pages. The highest authority had named the harm. And in the face of all that, the companies wrapped the cigarette once more in the brightest possible image of women's freedom and sold it to a new generation of young women as a badge of their liberation. They took the real and beautiful thing, the genuine progress women had made, and they pinned it to the very habit that the evidence now showed would harm and shorten the lives of those who took it up. The grain of truth. Here the truth of women's real advance stretched once more into the service of a lie. And it worked, as it had always worked, because the trick reached past the thinking mind to something deeper, to identity, to aspiration, to the wish to be the kind of woman the advertisement showed. A young woman in those years coming into her own, sensing the new horizons opening, might know in some abstract way that smoking was dangerous, might have seen the warning, might have heard the report's conclusions repeated, and still the image could reach her, the image of the free and modern woman with the slender cigarette, because the image did not argue with her knowledge. It bypassed her knowledge entirely and spoke to her hopes. And hopes, the companies had learned across half a century, will lead a person past a great deal of knowledge if the image is bright enough. This is the cruelest thread in the whole long weave, and it is worth naming clearly, gently before we let it go. The cigarette was sold to women, from the very beginning, as freedom, and it was the opposite of freedom. It was sold as independence, and it created dependence, the chemical dependence of the habit and the deeper dependence on the image that the habit was meant to confer. It was sold as a woman taking control of her body, her appetite, her figure, her nerves, and it took control away from her, hooking the body and harming it while the advertisement sang of liberation. The freedom was always the bait, the capture was always the point. And the freedom-shaped bait worked on the daughters as it had worked on the mothers. Think, if you can bear it softly, of the long line of women across those decades who believed the promise in its various forms. The young woman in the 1920s lighting her torch of freedom in the parade, the housewife in the 30s reaching for a lucky instead of a sweet, guarding the figure the advertisements taught her to fear losing, the anxious smoker in the 50s choosing the filter, doing what she thought was the careful thing, the young woman in the late 60s holding the slender cigarette as a badge of how far her sex had come. Different decades, different angles, the same essential promise, and the same essential betrayal beneath it. Generation after generation, the freedom offered and the harm delivered, the bright image and the dark result. What did they get, these women, for their belief? Some got the slimness for a while, the genuine appetite suppression that was the grain of truth at the bottom of it all. Some got the feeling of sophistication, of modernity, of belonging to the bright world the advertisements showed, and a great many of them got, in the end, the disease the report had named, the cancer and the heart trouble and the laboured breath, the harm that had been waiting all along beneath the promise, the future shadow the advertisements had told them, decades before, that the cigarette would help them avoid. The shadow they were told to reach for a lucky to escape was, in the end, the very thing the lucky brought. It would be easy here to slip into judgment of these women, to wonder how they could have believed, how generation after generation could have fallen for a trick so old. But that judgment misses the truth of it, which is that the trick was not aimed at their foolishness, but at their best and most human qualities, at their hope, their wish to be free, their care for their own bodies, their desire to be modern and independent and in control of their lives. The companies did not exploit what was weak in these women. They exploited what was strong and good and aspirational, turned it, used it, and that is precisely what makes the long deception so dark. The women were not foolish. They were human, and their humanity was the lever. And the deeper pattern, the one beneath even the cigarette, went on past all of it. For the cigarette was only one expression of a machinery older and more durable than any brand. The machinery that taught women to fear the loss of a slim figure, that turned the body into a site of constant anxious management, that sold relief from a fear it had helped to manufacture, did not vanish when the cigarette was finally named. It moved on, found new products, new promises, new ways to profit from a woman's uneasy relationship with her own body. The cigarette was a chapter in that longer story, a particularly dark and well-documented chapter, but only a chapter, and the book did not close when it ended. That is perhaps the last and quietest lesson of the long history, the one to carry gently into sleep. The specific lie was exposed. The cigarette was named, the doctors withdrew, the warning went on the package, and slowly, across the decades that followed, the smoke began to clear. But the machinery beneath the lie, the machinery that manufactures a fear and then sells the cure, that wraps a harm in the image of freedom, that reaches past the knowing mind to the hoping heart, that machinery proved more durable than any single product it ever moved. To see the cigarette's trick clearly is to be armed, a little, against the trick wherever it appears next, in whatever bright new image, with whatever fresh promise. But that is a waking thought, a thought for the daylight, and the daylight is not where you are now. You're in the dark at the end of a long history, watching the last of the women in the long line set down, at last the cigarette they were sold as freedom. The advertisements have gone quiet. The slender brand with its bright slogan has faded like all the rest into the past where it belongs. And the women, all of them, across all the decades, can be let go now, gently, with something like tenderness. For they were lied to with great skill by people who understood them far too well, and they deserve, at the very least, our gentleness as they fade. Let them fade then, the whole long line of them into the soft dark, the young woman with her torch, the housewife with her lucky, the anxious smoker with her filter, the daughter with her slender cigarette, and her bright slogan of freedom. They believed a beautiful lie, and many of them paid for it, and the believing was never their fault. Set them down gently, with the rest of the story, and let the room go quiet around you. There is only the ending left now, the last small room where we return to where we began and let the smoke dissolve at last into sleep. To understand how the long deception could work as completely as it did, you have to picture the world it worked in, a world so thoroughly filled with smoke that the smoke itself had become invisible, the way water is invisible to a fish. There was a time, not so very long ago, when the cigarette was simply everywhere, woven so deeply into the texture of ordinary life that to be without one in certain rooms was the thing that drew notice. The advertisements did not have to create the desire from nothing. They worked in a world already saturated, already accustomed, already breathing the smoke without thinking, and that saturation was itself one of the quiet engines of the whole machine. Picture a doctor's office in those years, the very office where a person went to be made well. There might be an ashtray on the doctor's desk, a handsome thing, and the doctor himself might light a cigarette as he spoke with his patient about her health, and neither of them would find anything strange in it. The man who would warn her, if anyone would, about the dangers of the habit was himself wreathed in its smoke as he gave the advice, and the contradiction was invisible because the smoke was everywhere. because everyone smoked, because the cigarette had become as ordinary as the chair she sat in. The advertisements showing doctors with cigarettes were not, in their setting, even surprising. They simply showed the world as it was. Picture the hospitals, where ashtrays stood in the waiting rooms and the smoke drifted down the corridors, where patients smoked in their beds and visitors smoked at the bedside and the staff smoked in their lounges. Picture the trains and the buses and the aeroplanes, all of them hazed with smoke, the air thick and blue with it. No one thinking to object because objecting would have been the strange thing. Picture the offices and the factories and the shops, the restaurants and the theatres and the homes, every interior space of the entire society filled hour after hour with the same drifting haze, so constant and so total that to notice it would have been like noticing the air. In such a world, the question that frames our whole story, the question of whether the cigarette was harmful, was almost impossible to feel as urgent, because the harm, if it existed, was distributed across an entire society breathing the same smoke, and a harm that everyone shares equally can come to seem like no harm at all, like simply a condition of life. If everyone smokes and the smoke is everywhere, then the smoke becomes part of the natural order. And a thing that is part of the natural order does not feel like a danger. It feels like weather. The very ubiquity of the cigarette was a kind of camouflage, hiding its harm inside the sheer ordinariness of its presence. And the companies understood this, and they worked to deepen it. For the more ordinary the cigarette seemed, the more woven into every scene of normal life, the harder it became for any individual to step back and see it clearly. Their advertisements did not only sell particular brands, they sold, beneath the brands, the ongoing normalcy of smoking itself, the sense that to smoke was simply what people did, modern people, sophisticated people, free people, healthy people, people like the ones in the bright photographs. The cigarette was shown in every setting of the good life, the dinner party and the office and the romance and the celebration, until it seemed not a product at all but a natural feature of living well. For a woman in such a world, the pressure to smoke was not only the pressure of any single advertisement, but the pressure of the whole saturated atmosphere, the sense that this was what women did now, modern women, that to abstain was to mark oneself as old-fashioned, prudish, behind the times. The advertisements provided the bright images and the medical reassurances and the promises of slimness, but the air provided something deeper, the simple, constant suggestion, breathed in everywhere, that smoking was normal and universal and fine. A person can resist an argument. It is much harder to resist an atmosphere, and the atmosphere of those decades was made of smoke. There is something almost dreamlike in picturing it now, from our cleared and aired vantage, the sheer totality of the haze. We have so thoroughly banished the smoke from our shared indoor spaces that it takes an effort of imagination to summon the world as it was, the blue air of every room, the ashtrays on every surface, the cigarette in every other hand. It was a different atmosphere, literally, a different air, and the people who lived in it could no more easily judge the cigarette than a person can judge the climate of the only place she's ever lived. They were inside it, they breathed it, and being inside it, they could not see its edges. This is why the clearing, when it finally came, was so slow and so strange, for it was not only a matter of convincing people of a fact, it was a matter of changing an atmosphere, of unsaturating an entire society, of making the smoke first visible and then strange and then, at last, unwelcome, of reversing a normalcy so total that it had become invisible. That reversal took decades, and it is one of the more remarkable transformations of recent history, the slow draining of the smoke from the shared air, the slow making strange of a thing that had once been as ordinary as breathing. We forget how total it was, and so we forget how large the change has been. For the women at the heart of our story, the saturated world meant that the lie they were told never had to stand alone, never had to convince them against a clear background of doubt. It was supported on every side by the simple fact that everyone was doing it, that the smoke was everywhere, that to smoke was merely to take one's place in the ordinary life of the time. The advertisement's particular promise, the slimness, the soothed nerves, the doctor's nod, landed in a mind already softened by an entire atmosphere of normalcy, and so it did not have to do all the work itself. The world did much of the work. The world was full of smoke. It is a strange comfort, perhaps, to remember from within our cleared air how thick that old atmosphere was, for it reminds us that even the most total normalcy can change, that an entire society can come, slowly, to see differently, to breathe differently, to find strange what it once found ordinary. The smoke that filled every room has drained away. The ashtrays have vanished from the hospitals and the aeroplanes and the doctors' desks. The air of our shared spaces is clear in a way that would have astonished the people of those decades, and the change came not by magic but by the patient accumulation of truth against a normalcy that had seemed unchangeable. So let the old smoke drift, in your mind, one last time, filling the rooms of the past, the offices and the trains and the bright advertised parties, blue and thick and total, and then let it begin, slowly, to thin. That is the direction the story moves from here, toward the clearing, toward the cleared air we breathe now without thinking, the quiet inheritance of a long correction. The haze that hid the harm is lifting, the rooms are growing clear, and you can breathe, here in the dark, the clear air that all that slow, patient truth-telling finally won, and rest in it, and be glad of it, without having to do anything at all to deserve it. The smoke thins. The rooms grow quiet and clear, and we have only a little further to go now, a few last reflections on how the whole long trick was worked and what it left behind, before we return to where we began, and let the story dissolve at last into sleep. Breathe the clear air. Let the old haze settle into the past, and drift gently on toward the ending, which is near now, and gentle and good. Of all the threads we have followed through this long night, there is one that deserves to be drawn out and looked at on its own, slowly, for it is the thread that made everything else possible, the small hard kernel of fact at the centre of the great soft lie. The cigarette companies told women that smoking would help keep them slim, and the reason that promise could be sold so successfully, the reason it could be dressed in the doctor's white coat and believed for so long, is that it was not entirely false. There was a grain of truth in it, a real and genuine fact, and that grain of truth was the foundation on which the whole elaborate deception was built. Nicotine, the substance the cigarette carried into the body, does in fact affect appetite. It is a genuine pharmacological reality, not an advertiser's invention. The substance can dull the sense of hunger, can shift the body's handling of energy in small ways, can make a person feel less drawn to food than she otherwise might. A smoker who reached for a cigarette instead of a snack was not imagining the effect. There was a real mechanism beneath it, a real chemical action, and a person who smoked instead of ate might indeed weigh a little less than she would have otherwise. The promise was not pure fiction. It had a true thing at its heart, and that is exactly what made it so dangerous. This is the pattern, the deep structure, that runs beneath the whole history we have followed, and it is worth understanding clearly, for it is older than the cigarette and will outlive it. A lie built from nothing is fragile, easily exposed, easily disbelieved. But a lie built around a grain of truth is sturdy, for the truth at its centre can always be pointed to, always be confirmed, always be felt by the person who experiences it. The smoker felt her hunger dull. She felt the effect was real because it was real. And feeling that one real thing, she was led to believe the whole vast structure built around it, the slimness as a virtue, the cigarette as a tool of self-care, the doctor's endorsement, the freedom, the rest. The companies did not invent the appetite effect. What they did, and it is a subtler and darker thing than simple invention, was to take that small, real effect and build around it a structure of meaning and value and reassurance entirely out of proportion to the fact itself. Yes, the cigarette might dull the appetite a little. From that small truth they constructed a world in which slimness was the supreme feminine virtue, in which the loss of the figure was a thing to be feared above almost all others, in which the cigarette was the wise woman's discreet tool for managing that fear, in which a doctor might reasonably recommend it. The grain of truth was the seed. The orchard grown from it was almost entirely a fabrication. And here is the cruelest part of the structure, the part worth holding gently as you drift. The small real benefit, the dulled appetite, was visible and immediate and felt, while the enormous real harm, the disease that grew silently across decades, was invisible and delayed and unfelt until far too late. The truth that supported the lie was a truth a woman could feel today, this hour, with this cigarette. The truth that condemned the lie was a truth she could not feel for 20 years, until it arrived all at once as illness. The whole deception lived in that gap, the gap between the small felt benefit and the large unfelt harm, and the companies built their fortune in that gap. You can see, when you look at it this way, why the cigarette was such a nearly perfect product for the kind of selling the companies practiced. It delivered a real, immediate, felt reward, the dulled hunger, the steadied nerves, the small lift, all of it genuine and present and confirmable in the moment. And it delivered its real cost only later, slowly, invisibly, in a form that could not be connected by the person experiencing it to the small, pleasant moments that had caused it. A product like that almost sells itself, for the customer's own experience seems, day by day, to confirm the benefit and to show no sign of the cost. The grain of truth was felt 1,000 times before the harm was felt once. This is why the appetite claim was the one the companies returned to again and again in their selling to women, the claim beneath all the other claims. The slimness was the felt thing, the confirmable thing, the thing a woman's own scale and mirror seemed to verify. Reach for a lucky instead of a sweet, the advertisement said, and a woman who did so and did not gain the weight she feared took that as proof she could see that the cigarette was doing what it promised. She could not see the other thing it was doing, she could only see the figure preserved, and the preserved figure seemed to vouch for the whole arrangement, the grain of truth standing in for the orchard of lies. It is worth saying plainly in the quiet that this structure, the felt small good masking the unfelt large harm, is not unique to the cigarette, and that is perhaps the most useful thing to carry out of this long history. Many of the things that harm us most do exactly this. They offer a real, immediate, felt reward and exact a real, delayed, invisible cost, and they live in the gap between the two. To understand the cigarette's trick is to understand a pattern that recurs, to learn to ask, of any felt pleasant thing, not only what it gives me now, but what it may be quietly taking across the years I cannot yet feel. The cigarette is the clearest teacher of that lesson the recent past affords. But this is, again, a thought for the daylight, and you are not in the daylight. You are in the dark near the end of the long story, and the grain of truth can be set down now with all the rest. The companies are gone. The appetite claim has been stripped of its power, seen through, exposed for the small true thing pressed into the service of a vast false promise that it always was. You do not have to weigh the felt benefit against the unfelt harm tonight. The weighing has been done by history and the answer is settled, and you can rest in the settled answer without any further effort of your own. So let the grain of truth rest where it belongs, small and hard and finally harmless, at the centre of a lie that has been taken apart around it. It was real. The appetite did dull, and that one real thing was used across decades to sell a habit that harmed the very women it promised to serve. Knowing that, seeing the structure clearly is its own quiet protection, the kind of seeing that cannot be unseen. You have it now. You can carry it lightly, and you can let it go for tonight, into the soft dark where nothing is being sold to you and nothing is required of you, and the only thing to do is breathe. We are very near the end now. There is one last reflection to gather, the full shape of the trick laid out plainly, and then the return to where we began, the magazine on the table, the smoke in the photograph, the long slow dissolve into sleep. Stay if you wish for these last gentle rooms, or let go now if sleep is near, for the story will hold and the grain of truth and all the rest. Breathe the clear air, the ending is close, and it asks nothing of you but rest. Before we return to where we began and let the night close over the story, it is worth gathering, slowly and gently, the full shape of the thing we have watched unfold, for across all these rooms and decades the cigarette companies were not improvising. They were practicing an art, a dark and coherent art, with parts that fit together, and seeing those parts laid out plainly, one beside another, is the closest this long history comes to a kind of resolution. Not a victory exactly, and not a comfort, but a clarity. The clarity of understanding fully a trick that was worked on millions of people across the better part of a century. The first part of the art, the foundation, you already know, for we have just looked at it closely. It was the grain of truth, the small real fact at the centre, the genuine dulling of appetite that made the whole structure credible. Every durable deception begins here, with something true that can be pointed to, something the target can feel and confirm, so that the lie built around it borrows the solidity of the fact at its heart. Without the grain of truth, the cigarette's promise would have been mere fantasy, easily disbelieved. With it, the promise had a foundation in real experience, and on that foundation everything else could be built. The second part of the art was the manufactured fear, the careful cultivation of a dread that the product could then relieve. The companies did not merely promise slimness, they worked, alongside the whole machinery of the age, to make the loss of slimness a thing to be feared, to turn the female body into a site of constant anxious management, to plant the worry that the cigarette would then offer to soothe. This is the deepest move of all. For a product that relieves a fear must first ensure the fear exists, and the most profitable fears are the ones the seller has helped to create. Manufacture the worry, then sell the relief. The cigarette companies did not invent this, but they practiced it with rare skill. The third part was the borrowed authority, the white coat, the doctor, the journal, the man of science vouching for the smoke. The companies understood that people would believe from a trusted figure what they would never believe from an obvious salesman, and so they reached for the most trusted figure of all, the physician, and draped the cigarette in his borrowed dignity. The doctor in the advertisement, the survey of physicians, the cigarette among the columns of the medical journal, all of it was the same move, the renting of trust that the companies had not earned and could not have earned, the dressing of a commercial product in the robes of healing. The fourth part was the true statement arranged to leave a false impression, the most technically elegant tool in the whole kit. Again and again the companies made claims that were, in their narrow literal sense, defensible, while the impression those claims created was entirely false. A survey did find that more doctors named one brand, after the doctors had been handed that brand for free. A figure was technically accurate while the conclusion it invited was a lie. This was the art of telling the truth in such a way that the listener believes something false, and it allowed the companies to deceive while retaining, always, the defense that they had never quite lied. The words were true, the meaning was false, and the gap between them was where the deception lived. The fifth part, which came late but proved the most poisonous, was the manufactured doubt, the deliberate fogging of a science that had grown inconvenient. When the evidence could no longer be denied, the companies learned that it did not have to be denied, only muddied that a public kept uncertain would go on, as a public convinced of safety would, that the appearance of disagreement among experts was nearly as useful as actual agreement on their side. And so they funded the fog, cultivated the doubt, kept the question seeming open long after it had closed, buying years and decades for the habit by ensuring that the truth, however clear, never quite seemed settled to the comfortable mind that did not wish it to be. And the sixth part, wrapped around all the others, was the bright image, the aspiration, the dream sold alongside the product, the freedom and modernity and sophistication that the cigarette was made to represent. The torches of freedom, the slender brand with its bright slogan, the photographs of the lives a woman might wish to live, all of it reached past the thinking mind to the hoping heart, attached the cigarette to a woman's deepest aspirations, and made setting it down feel like setting down a piece of who she wished to be. This was the part that worked even on those who knew, the part that bypassed knowledge entirely and spoke to longing, and it was, in the end, perhaps the most powerful part of all. Look at them together then, these 6 parts of the art, for laid side by side they make a kind of dark machine, the grain of truth for credibility, the manufactured fear to create the need, the borrowed authority to vouch for the answer, the true statement to deceive without lying, the manufactured doubt to delay the reckoning, the bright image to reach past the mind to the heart, each part covering the weakness of the others, the whole far stronger than the sum, a machine for moving a harmful product into the lives of people who would, if they could have seen it whole, have wanted nothing to do with it. They could not see it whole. That was the point. The machine was built so that no one inside it could. And here is why it matters to see it whole tonight, gently, before sleep, as something more than a story about cigarettes. The cigarette is gone, or going, its particular trick exposed and its particular harm now taught to every child. But the machine, the art, the 6-part structure, did not die with the cigarette. It was a discovery, a technique, and techniques outlive the products that teach them. The same machine, or parts of it, can be found at work wherever something harmful is being sold as helpful, wherever a fear is being manufactured and a relief sold, wherever authority is being borrowed and doubt manufactured and a bright image wrapped around a quiet cost. To know the cigarette's trick is to be able to recognize its descendants. But recognizing them is daylight work, and you have done enough for one night simply by understanding fully and clearly the shape of what was done to those women across those decades. You can set the whole machine down now, all 6 parts of it, and let it rest in the past where it was built and where, for the most part, it has been dismantled. The understanding will keep. It does not require your vigilance tonight. It will be there in the morning, a quiet clarity you did not have before, and you can carry it lightly into whatever comes, armed a little better against the bright promises of the world. For now, though, there is only the dark and the warmth and the slow approach of sleep, and the last small thing left to do, which is to return to where we began. The magazine on the table, the woman in the photograph with her cigarette and her serene assurance, the doctor's recommendation in careful type. We open the night there, in that bright false world, and we will close it there, watching the smoke in the photograph begin, at last, to dissolve. Come back with me to the beginning gently, for the ending of this story is a returning, and the returning is nearly done. Breathe. Let the machine rest. Let the 6 parts settle into the past, and let yourself drift the last small distance toward the place where we started. The quiet room, the table, the magazine, the photograph slowly losing its hold. The story is almost told. The night is almost whole, and there is nothing left for you to do but follow it gently down into sleep. There is a question that hangs over this whole long history, quiet and uncomfortable, and it is worth approaching gently now, near the end, in the dark where hard things can be looked at softly. The question is this: did the men who ran the companies, the men who funded the doubt and dressed the cigarette in the doctor's coat, did they know what they were doing? Did they understand that the thing they were selling caused the harm the evidence pointed to, even as they paid to keep that harm uncertain in the public mind? And the answer that emerged slowly across the decades that followed, is one of the heaviest in the story. Many of them knew. They knew, and they sold anyway. Inside the companies, away from the bright advertisements and the public statements of concern, there were laboratories, and in those laboratories there were researchers, careful and competent, studying the smoke and what it did. And what those researchers found year after year was not reassuring. They learned about the harm. They learned about the substance in the smoke and the way it held the smoker, the dependence it created, the difficulty of setting it down. They were in many cases ahead of the public science, not behind it, for they had every reason to study closely the thing their fortunes depended on. The knowledge accumulated inside the buildings even as the doubt was being broadcast outside them. Imagine the strange divided life of such a place, the company that knew 2 things at once and kept them in separate rooms. In one room, the research, the quiet accumulating evidence of harm and dependence, studied by serious people doing serious work. In another room, the advertising, the doubt campaigns, the public assurances that the question remained open, that the science was unsettled, that the company cared deeply for the health of its customers. The 2 rooms in the same building, the knowledge and the denial, separated by a wall that the men at the top could see over and chose not to. They knew what was in the one room while they paid for what came out of the other. This is a darkness of a particular and modern kind, the darkness not of ignorance but of knowledge suppressed, of a truth possessed and hidden, of men who understood the harm their product did and who spent their working lives ensuring that the people buying it would not understand the same. It is one thing to sell a harmful product believing it's safe. It is another thing entirely to sell it knowing, to fund the fog while reading the clear reports, to broadcast doubt about a conclusion your own laboratories have reached. The men who did this were not confused. They were not deceived along with their customers. They saw clearly, and they chose the sale over the truth, again and again, for years. Why, you might ask, drifting there? Why would men do such a thing knowing what they knew? And the answer is not exotic. It is ordinary, which is what makes it so chilling. They did it for the reasons people have always done such things, for money, for the momentum of an enterprise too large and too profitable to stop, for the comfort of shared responsibility in a large organization where no single person feels himself to be the one doing the harm. Each man could tell himself that he only ran the laboratory, or only wrote the advertisements, or only managed the business, that the responsibility lay elsewhere, diffused across the whole vast machine. And so the machine did what no single man might have done alone. This is the same pattern we saw long ago in the early rooms of this story, when the betrayal was divided into pieces too small for any one person to feel as betrayal. The doctor who lent his name felt he had only signed a paper. The man who wrote the advertisement felt he had only done his job. And now, at the top, the men who knew felt they had only managed an enterprise, only kept a business running, only declined to volunteer a truth that no law yet required them to speak. The harm, monstrous in its total, was assembled from acts each of which its doer could excuse. That is how the largest wrongs are usually done, not by monsters, but by ordinary people each holding a small and excusable piece. The knowledge inside the companies did not stay hidden forever. In time, long after the years we have mostly dwelt in, the inner records came to light. The documents from the laboratories and the boardrooms, the evidence of what had been known and when and by whom. And when they came to light, they confirmed what the long pattern of behaviour had already suggested, that the companies had known far more, far earlier, than they had ever admitted, that the public doubt had been manufactured by men who privately entertained no doubt at all. The wall between the two rooms came down eventually, and what stood revealed behind it was knowledge, clear and early and deliberately hidden. For the women at the heart of our story, this is the final turn of the knife, gently as we must hold it. They were not merely sold a product that turned out, to everyone's surprise, to be harmful. They were sold a product that the sellers knew to be harmful, by men who had read the evidence and chosen to bury it, who funded the fog precisely because they could see through it themselves. The trust those women placed in the doctor, in the brand, in the reassuring voice of the company that professed such concern for their health, was betrayed not by accident, but by design, by people who knew exactly what that trust was worth and exactly how they were spending it. And yet, even here, even at the heaviest point in the story, there is something that can be set down rather than carried, for the knowing has now become our knowing too. The wall came down, the documents came out. What the men in the laboratories knew and hid is known now to everyone, taught openly beyond any further hiding. The very thing they worked so hard to keep secret, the early certainty of the harm, is now among the most public facts in the world. Their suppression failed, in the end, completely. The truth they buried did not stay buried. It rose slowly and stands now in full daylight, and nothing they did can put it back in the ground. So let the men who knew rest, too, in the past, with everything else. Their secret is out. Their fog has cleared. Their divided buildings, the knowledge in one room and the denial in the other, have been opened and seen through, and the knowledge has won, as suppressed truth so often finally does, by the simple patience of its refusal to disappear. You can hold what they did with a clear eye and a quiet heart, neither flinching from it nor carrying it as a weight, for it is finished, exposed, concluded, a darkness that has had the light let fully into it at last. We are at the last turning now. We have followed every thread, the grain of truth and the manufactured fear, the borrowed coat and the true statement and the manufactured doubt, the bright image and the men who knew. There is nothing left to expose, no room left unopened. All that remains is to ask what the long story leaves behind, what remained when the smoke finally cleared, and then to return, as we promised, to the quiet room where we began, and let the night close gently over all of it. Come gently on toward the ending. It is very near now, and there is nothing left in it but rest. What remained? When the long deception had at last been named and the smoke had begun its slow retreat from the shared air, the question that remained was the quietest and the largest of all. What was left behind? What did the long century of the cigarette and its sellers leave in the world when the worst of it was finally over? And the answer is not simple, for some of what remained was loss, and some was harm that could not be undone, and some, perhaps, was a kind of hard-won wisdom, the only sort this story was ever going to yield. What remained, first and most heavily, were the people, the women and men who had taken up the habit on the strength of the bright promises, and who carried in their bodies the cost the promises had hidden. The harm done across those decades did not vanish when the truth was told. It lived on in the people it had been done to, in illness and early loss, and the long, slow consequences of a habit sold as harmless. No report, no warning, no reckoning could reach back and undo what had already been set in motion in all those lives. That much remained, and must be held honestly, even gently, even here. The cost was real, and it was paid, and it could not be unpaid. What remained, too, was the changed world, the cleared air, the transformed understanding, and this was the better part of the inheritance. The society that had once breathed smoke in every room learned, slowly, to breathe clear. The cigarette that had once seemed as ordinary as weather became a thing understood, labelled, hedged with warning, set apart from the easy normalcy it had enjoyed for so long. Children grew up knowing what their grandparents had not been allowed to know. The trick exposed lost much of its power, for a trick understood is a trick half disarmed. The world did not go back to what it had been before. It went forward into a clearer knowledge, and that clarity remained. What remained, also, was a lesson about trust, hard and useful, written across the whole history. The cigarette had risen to power on borrowed trust, the trust people placed in their doctors, in science, in the reassuring voice of authority. And the lesson the long deception taught, the lesson paid for so dearly, was that trust can be borrowed and bent, that the white coat can be rented, that the voice of reassurance may be funded by the very interest it reassures you about. This is a hard lesson, for trust is necessary and good, and a life lived without it is a poorer life. But it is a true lesson, and learning it, the world grew a little warier, a little harder to fool in quite that particular way again. And what remained, perhaps most usefully of all, was the pattern itself, made visible, available to be recognized wherever it should appear again. We traced it through all these rooms, the 6-part machine, the grain of truth, and the manufactured fear, and the borrowed authority and the rest. That machine did not die with the cigarette, but neither did the understanding of it. The story of the cigarette doctors became, in time, a kind of teaching story, a clear and well-documented example of how a harmful thing can be sold as helpful, studied and retold precisely so that the next version of the trick might be caught a little sooner. The deception remained, in that sense, as a warning, which is the most that any such history can hope to become. There is a temptation, looking back across it all, to let the story curdle into cynicism, to conclude that authority is always corrupt, that trust is always foolish, that the bright promise is always a lie. But that conclusion would be its own kind of error, and a sad one, for it is not the lesson the history actually teaches. The doctors, in the end, turned. The journals closed their pages, the science, patiently, won. The truth, suppressed and fogged and fought at every step, rose anyway and stands now in the daylight. The story is not finally a story of authority's corruption, but of authority's slow recovery, of the truth's slow victory, of a wrong built across decades and then, across more decades, painstakingly set right. That is the shape worth carrying out of the long night, gentler than cynicism, and truer to what actually happened. The deception was real, and the harm was real, and the men who knew were real. And also the correction was real, the turning was real, the clearing of the air was real, the truth standing now in full daylight is real. Both halves are true together, the wrong and its righting, and to hold only the first half is to misremember the story, to forget that it ends, however slowly and partially, in the truth winning. It did win, late and at great cost, and never completely, but it won. For the women at the centre of it all, the long line of them across the decades, what remained was a kind of vindication they mostly did not live to see. The full exposure of the lie they had been told, the public knowledge of exactly how and why they had been deceived. They were not foolish, and the world knows now that they were not foolish. They were lied to with great skill by people who understood them too well and cared for them not at all. That is the truth that remained about them, and it is a truer and kinder truth than the one the advertisements told, and they are owed it, all of them, the simple acknowledgement that the fault was never theirs. And what remains for you, here at the end of the long telling, drifting at the edge of sleep, is something smaller and quieter than all of this, but yours. You know the story now, whole, from the bright magazine advertisement to the men who knew. You have walked through all its rooms, you have seen the trick laid bare, and you can carry that knowing lightly, the way you carry anything you understand fully and need not fear, a small clear lamp against the next bright promise, whenever and however it comes. That is what remained for you. The rest you can set down. So set it down now, all of it, the whole long history, gently, the way you have set down each piece as we came to it. The companies are gone or going, the smoke has cleared, the truth has won, slowly and late and well. There is nothing left to understand tonight, nothing left to hold, nothing left to do. We have reached the end of the long building, the last room, and through its window you can see the place where we began, the quiet room, the table, the magazine, the photograph with its serene false promise. Come back to it with me now, gently for the very last time. The story is told, what remained remains, and the night is ready at last to close. So here we are again, back where the night began, in the quiet room with the lamp turned low and the magazine open on the table. The same photograph waits on the page, the woman with her serene assurance, the cigarette held just so, the doctor's careful recommendation printed in its trustworthy type. It looks the same as it did when we started, and yet it is not the same at all, for you can see it now in a way you could not see it then. You know what is behind the serene assurance. You know who arranged the doctor's words and why. You know the whole long machinery that produced this one bright false page, and knowing it, you can look at the photograph without being touched by it, the way you can watch a magician's trick once you have been shown how it is done. Look at the woman in the photograph one last time, gently, without judgment, for she is not your enemy and never was. She's one of the long line we followed through the whole story, the believers, the ones who were told a beautiful lie by people who understood them too well. She holds her cigarette and smiles her serene smile, and behind the smile is everything we came to know. The fear that was manufactured, the freedom that was promised, the harm that was hidden, the trust that was spent. She does not know any of it. She only knows the bright promise, and you can look at her now with something like tenderness, for you know what she was not allowed to know. And now, as you watch, something begins to happen to the photograph, there in the low lamplight at the edge of sleep. The smoke in the picture, the elegant curl of it rising from the cigarette, begins slowly to loosen. It begins to drift, to soften at its edges, to come apart. The sharp, bright certainty of the advertisement begins to blur. The serene assurance grows indistinct. The careful type of the doctor's recommendation dims and runs together. The whole bright false page begins gently to dissolve, the way everything in this story has dissolved, the companies and the campaigns and the manufactured doubt, all of it thinning, fading, drifting away into the past where it belongs. Let it dissolve. There is nothing in it to hold on to, nothing in it you need. The smoke loosens and rises and thins. The woman's serene smile softens and fades. The doctor's words blur and are gone. The magazine itself seems to grow indistinct upon the table, its bright page going soft and grey and quiet, until there is nothing left of the advertisement at all, nothing left of the long lie, only the dim warm room and the low lamp, and you, here, at the end of the night, watching the last of the smoke disappear. The air is clear now, the smoke has gone, the whole long century of it, the haze that filled every room, the bright promises and the hidden harms, all of it has drifted away into the past, leaving the air around you clear and cool and easy to breathe. You did nothing to clear it. It was cleared by the slow, patient work of people who told the truth against the fog, year after year until the fog could not stand, and now you get to breathe the clear air they won, here in the dark, without any effort of your own, the quiet inheritance of a long correction finally complete. There is nothing left to understand now, nothing left to follow, nothing left to hold. The story is fully told, from the first bright advertisement to the last cleared room. Every thread has been followed to its end. Every door has been opened. The whole long history has been laid out and looked at and gently set down, and now it can rest, all of it, in the past, and you can rest here, in the present, in the dark, in the clear air, with nothing required of you at all. Let your breath go slow now, slower than the story, slow as the dissolving smoke. There is nowhere to be and nothing to do, and no promise to weigh, and no fear to manage. All of that belonged to the bright false world of the advertisement, and the advertisement has dissolved. Here there is only the quiet and the warmth, and the soft weight of your own tiredness, drawing you down, gently, the way the end of a long day draws you down toward the rest you have earned simply by living through it. Let the room grow dim around you, let the lamp burn low and then lower. Let the last image of the magazine fade entirely from your mind, replaced by nothing, by soft dark, by the simple comfort of lying still at the end of a long telling. You're safe here. The smoke cannot reach you. The promises cannot touch you. The whole long machinery of the lie has wound down and gone quiet, and there is nothing left of it now but a story you know, held lightly, fading itself into the general softness of a mind letting go. Drift now. Let the words themselves begin to lose their shape, to soften and blur the way the photograph softened and blurred, to become just sound, just a low warm murmur in the dark, no longer asking anything of you, no longer telling you anything you need to follow. The meaning can go, the story can go. You can keep what you learned without holding on to a single word of it, and the words can dissolve like the smoke, into the quiet, into the dark, into sleep. Rest now. The long night of the story is over and your own night, the real one, the good one, is here. There is nothing more to know, there is nothing more to do. There is only the dark and the quiet and the slow soft tide of sleep, rising gently to carry you out past the last of the smoke, past the last of the story, into the deep and dreamless rest you can sink into now, completely, and let go. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. And before you drift off completely, I would love to know what you made of this one. Of all the parts of the cigarette doctor's story, which moment unsettled you the most? The doctors in the white coats, the rigged surveys, the manufactured doubt, or the men who quietly knew? If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. Sleep well.